the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a glamorous party at Willow Cottage hides a deadly secret. When young housekeeper Clara Brent collapses, poisoned under the twinkling lanterns, Miss Jane Marple's keen eyes spot a chilling clue torn, letter hinting at a long-buried crime. As whispers of a widower's dark past and a vengeful motive swirl, Miss Marple unravels a web of deceit, betrayal, and murder. In 14 chapters, follow her as she uncovers the truth behind Clara's death, and a killer's hidden motive, proving no secret stays buried in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 1. The Village Scandal. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient elms that lined the high street. The village, nestled in the heart of the English countryside, was a picture of serene order, neat cottages with thatched roofs, gardens bursting with roses, and the church spire standing sentinel over the community. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, St. Mary Mead thrived on the undercurrents of gossip, the lifeblood of its inhabitants. And this summer, the village had a new topic to dissect. Mr. Reginald Hawthorne, the enigmatic widower who had recently taken up residence at Willow Cottage. Miss Jane Marple, with her snow-white hair tucked neatly beneath a sensible hat, sat in her favourite armchair by the window of her cottage, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. Her view of the high street was unobstructed, offering a front-row seat to the comings and goings of her neighbours. She had always found the village a microcosm of human nature, its small dramas revealing truths as profound as those in any bustling city. Today, her sharp blue eyes were alert, for the air was thick with whispers about Mr. Hawthorne, and Miss Marple never dismissed gossip outright. It so often held a kernel of truth. The trouble had begun 3 weeks ago, when Mr. Hawthorne, a man of perhaps 50, arrived in St. Mary Mead with little fanfare but much speculation. Willow Cottage, a charming, if slightly dilapidated property on the edge of the village, had stood empty since old Mrs. Haverford's passing, its sudden occupancy by a stranger, wealthy one, by all accounts set tongues wagging. Hawthorne was tall, with a distinguished air, his dark hair streaked with silver and his tailored suits hinting at a life of means. Yet his reticence, his refusal to engage in the village's social rituals beyond the bare minimum, only fueled curiosity. Who was he? Why had he chosen St. Mary Mead? And, most intriguingly, what had happened to his late wife, whose death was mentioned only in hushed tones? Miss Marple's first encounter with the man had been at the village post office, where she'd gone to mail a letter to her nephew, Raymond West. Hawthorne had been there, collecting a parcel, his manner polite but distant. He'd nodded curtly to Mrs. Bantry, who had tried to draw him into conversation about the weather, and left without so much as a smile. Mrs. Bantry, never one to let a rebuff go unremarked, had turned to Miss Marple with a raised eyebrow. "Well, Jane," she'd said, "he's a queer one, isn't he? Not the sort to settle in St. Mary Mead, I'd wager." Miss Marple had merely smiled, her mind already cataloguing the encounter. She had seen men like Hawthorne before, men who carried secrets in the set of their shoulders, in the way their eyes avoided lingering too long on any one face. She did not judge hastily, but she observed, and her observations were rarely wrong. This morning, as she knitted a pale blue shawl for her friend Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of her maid, Cherry Baker, bearing a tray of tea and biscuits. Cherry, a lively young woman with a penchant for village news, was practically bursting with information. "Have you heard, Miss Marple?" Cherry said, setting the tray down with a clatter. "There's to be another party at Willow Cottage. Tonight, the whole village is talking about it." Mr. Hawthorne's invited half the county, it seems, though nobody knows why. Mrs. Price at the shop says he's got cases of champagne delivered, and there's a caterer coming from Much Benham. Miss Marple's needles paused. A party, you say? How very interesting. Mr. Hawthorne doesn't strike me as the sociable type. That's just it, Cherry exclaimed, her eyes wide. Nobody can make him out. Some say he's lonely, living in that big house with only that housekeeper, Clara Brent, to keep things running. Others say he's hiding something. Did you know his wife died years ago? They say it was an accident, but... Cherry lowered her voice conspiratorially. Mrs. Price heard from her cousin in London that there was talk of foul play. Never. Proven, mind you, but still. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression placid but her mind alert. Gossip is a dangerous thing, Cherry, she said mildly. But it does make one wonder. Clara Brent, you say? She's a local girl, isn't she? Oh yes, Miss Marple. Born and bred in St. Mary Mead. Her mother used to work for the vicar, but Clara's been with Mr. Hawthorne since he arrived. She's young, only about 25, and ever so pretty. Some folk think she's too pretty to be just a housekeeper, if you catch my meaning. Miss Marple did catch Cherry's meaning, but she made no comment. Instead, she filed away the information about Clara Brent, picturing the girl's delicate features and nervous demeanour, which she'd noticed at the church bazaar last week. Clara had been serving tea, her hands trembling slightly as she passed. A cup to Mrs. Grayson, a sharp-tongued widow who lived next to Willow Cottage. There had been an odd moment, Miss Marple recalled, when Mrs. Grayson had made a pointed remark about upstarts in the village, and Clara had flushed deeply before hurrying away. The day passed quietly, with Miss Marple tending to her roses, and exchanging pleasantries with passers-by, but her thoughts kept returning to Willow Cottage and the party that promised to draw the village's attention. By late afternoon, she had decided to attend, accepting an invitation extended through Mrs. Bantry, who was thrilled at the prospect of seeing inside Hawthorne's home. It's not every day we get a glimpse into a mystery man's life, Jane, Mrs. Bantry had said, her eyes sparkling with anticipation as evening fell. Miss Marple dressed in her best black lace, her brooch gleaming at her throat. She arrived at Willow Cottage with Mrs. Bantry, whose husband, Colonel Bantry, had declined to attend, muttering about newcomers and their nonsense. The cottage was transformed, its gardens lit with lanterns, and a string quartet playing softly on the lawn. Guests milled about, sipping champagne and nibbling on canapes, their voices a low hum of excitement and speculation. Mr. Hawthorne stood at the centre of it all, greeting guests with a practised smile. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his manner polished but guarded. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting how his eyes flickered toward the house whenever someone approached too closely. Clara Brent moved among the guests, her auburn hair catching the light as she carried trays of drinks. She was indeed pretty, Miss Marple thought, but there was a strain in her expression, a wariness that suggested more than the usual pressures of a housekeeper's duties. The party was in full swing when Miss Marple found herself seated near the rose garden, a vantage point that allowed her to observe without being conspicuous. She listened as Mrs. Grayson, her voice sharp with indignation, spoke to a group of women nearby. "It's disgraceful," Mrs. Grayson was saying, "the way that girl carries on. Clara Brent, acting as if she owns the place, and Mr. Hawthorne, encouraging her. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more to it than meets the eye." Miss Marple's needles, tucked into her reticule for the evening, might have clicked in agreement if they'd been in her hands. She had seen such dynamics before: a young woman in a powerful man's employ, a village quick to judge, and a past tragedy casting a long shadow. But she said nothing, merely sipped her lemonade and listened as the conversation turned to Hawthorne's late wife, Anna. "She died in a fall, didn't she?" asked Mrs. Price, the shopkeeper's wife, her tone cautious. "Up in Yorkshire, I heard. Slipped on a cliff path during a storm." "That's what they say," Mrs. Grayson replied, her lips pursed. "But my cousin in Leeds knew a maid who worked for them. She said Anna Hawthorne was never the same after her marriage. Nervous, sickly. And then, poof, she's gone, and he's richer for it." Miss Marple tilted her head, as if admiring the roses, but her mind was racing. A sudden death, an inheritance, a new life in a quiet village was a pattern she recognized from other cases, other lives. She made a mental note to inquire further about Anna Hawthorne, perhaps through her old friend Lady Harmon, who had connections in Yorkshire. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple noticed Clara Brent growing increasingly agitated. The girl's hands shook as she refilled glasses, and once, when Hawthorne spoke to her sharply, she flinched as if struck. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. There was fear there, she was certain, but fear of what? Or whom? The party reached its peak, with laughter and music filling the air, when a sudden cry shattered the merriment. It came from the far end of the garden, near the old well, where a cluster of guests had gathered. Miss Marple rose, her small frame moving with surprising agility, and followed Mrs. Bantry toward the commotion. There, lying motionless on the grass, was Clara Brent. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with an unnatural blue. A glass of champagne lay spilled beside her, its contents seeping into the earth. Dr. Simon Wells, the village doctor, knelt beside her, his fingers searching for a pulse. He looked up, his face grim, and shook his head. "She's gone," he said quietly. "No pulse." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm, her voice trembling. "Jane, what's happened? Is she dead?" Miss Marple's eyes were fixed on Clara's still form, taking in every detail: the glass, the blue tinge, the faint smell of almonds in the air. "I'm afraid so, Dolly," she said softly, "and I rather think this is no accident." Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, his face set in the determined lines of a man who knew his duty but dreaded its implications. The guests were herded into the drawing-room, their chatter now subdued, while the police cordoned off the garden. Miss Marple remained near the edge of the scene, her presence unobtrusive but her senses sharp. She noted the way Hawthorne stood apart, his face pale but composed, the way Mrs. Grayson's eyes darted nervously, the way Dr. Wells hovered near the body, as if reluctant to leave. Craddock approached Miss Marple, his expression a mix of respect and exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "I might have known you'd be here. Any thoughts?" "Not yet, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild. "But I do wonder about that glass. And Clara's behavior tonight seemed troubled." Craddock nodded, jotting a note. "Poison, likely. We'll need the coroner to confirm, but that smell. Cyanide, I'd wager. Fast-acting, someone meant business." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. Cyanide was not a common poison, not in a village like St. Mary Mead. It required intent, planning, access. Her mind flickered to the suspects already forming in her thoughts. Hawthorne, with his shadowed past. Mrs. Grayson, with her venomous tongue. Dr. Wells, with his medical knowledge, and perhaps others yet to emerge. As the guests were questioned and dismissed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the garden. She noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper near the well, half hidden by a rosebush. With a quick glance to ensure no one was watching, she bent and retrieved it, tucking it into her reticule. It was too dark to read now, but she would examine it later. In the quiet of her cottage, the night ended with Willow Cottage shrouded in silence, its lanterns extinguished, its host retreating behind locked doors. Miss Marple walked home with Mrs. Bantry, who was full of theories and indignation. "It's dreadful, Jane," she said. "Poor Clara. Who would do such a thing?" "Someone with a reason, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but her mind already turning over the puzzle. "And I intend to find out what it was." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and unfolded the paper she'd found. It was a fragment of a letter, written in a hurried hand. "Know the truth about Anna. Meet me at the well. You're in danger." The signature was missing, torn away, but the words sent a chill through her. Clara had been seeking answers, and someone had silenced her for it. As she settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed its steady rhythm. The village scandal had taken a deadly turn, and Miss Marple knew that St. Mary Mead, for all its sleepy charm, was about to reveal its secrets. She would watch and listen and piece together the clues, for she had seen such darkness before, and she knew how to bring it to light. Chapter 2. A shocking discovery. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried the faint scent of roses and the distant hum of laughter as Willow Cottage glowed with the warmth of Mr. Reginald Hawthorne's lavish party. The grand house, newly occupied by the wealthy widower, stood at the edge of the village, its windows spilling golden light onto the manicured lawn. Inside, the clink of champagne glasses and the murmur of conversation filled the air, a rare spectacle for the sleepy village. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in a corner of the drawing-room, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to the lively chatter around her. She wore a simple, lavender dress, her white hair neatly pinned, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. The party was a curious affair. Hawthorne, a man of imposing presence with silver hair and a meticulously tailored suit, moved among his guests with practiced charm. His arrival in St. Mary Mead 3 months prior had stirred the village's gossip mill, and tonight's gathering only fueled the speculation. Who was this man, with his fortune and his secretive air? Why had he chosen a quiet village to settle in, far from the bustle of London? And what, Miss Marple wondered, lay behind the faint unease she detected in his polished smile? Among the guests were familiar faces. Mrs. Lila Grayson, a sharp-tongued widow with a penchant for gossip. Dr. Simon Wells, the village doctor, whose reserved demeanour hid a keen intelligence. And Thomas Hawthorne, Reginald's nephew, a lanky young man with a sullen expression. But it was Clara Brent, the young housekeeper, who drew Miss Marple's attention. Clara, barely 20, flitted about the room, her auburn hair catching the light as she refilled glasses and offered trays of canapé. She was efficient, graceful even, but there was a nervous edge to her movements, a quick glance over her shoulder, a slight tremble in her hands as she passed a tray to Mrs. Grayson. Miss Marple's needles paused as she watched Clara. The girl had been in Hawthorne's employ for only a month, yet she seemed to carry a weight far heavier than her duties warranted. Earlier that evening, as Miss Marple had arrived, she'd overheard Clara speaking in hushed tones to Mary, the grocer's daughter, near the garden gate. "I can't talk now," Clara had whispered, her voice tight. It's too dangerous. Mary had frowned, pressing Clara's hand, but the housekeeper had hurried back inside before more could be said. Miss Marple filed the moment away, her mind already turning over possibilities. The party continued, the guests growing merrier as the champagne flowed. Hawthorne stood by the grand piano, regaling a small group with a story of his travels in Italy. His voice was rich, his gestures expansive, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward Clara whenever she passed. Was it concern, affection, or something else? Mrs. Grayson, standing nearby, muttered something to her companion about that girl and gold-digging. Her lips pursed in disapproval. Dr. Wells, meanwhile, lingered near the fireplace, his gaze fixed on his glass as if lost in thought. Thomas Hawthorne, slouched against a wall, sipped his drink with an air of resentment, his eyes following his uncle with barely concealed disdain. As the clock struck 9, the atmosphere shifted. A sudden scream pierced the room, sharp and raw, cutting through the laughter. The guests froze, glasses poised mid-air. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the room. The scream had come from outside, from the garden. Hawthorne's face paled, and he strode toward the French doors, the guests parting before him. Miss Marple rose, tucking her knitting into her bag, and followed at a discreet distance, her curiosity peaked outside. The garden was bathed in moonlight, the neatly trimmed hedges casting long shadows. A small crowd had already gathered near. The rose arbor, where a figure lay crumpled on the grass. It was Clara Brent, her auburn hair fanned out around her, and her face, even in the dim light, was unnaturally pale. Her hands clutched at her throat, and a faint froth glistened at the corner of her mouth. Dr. Wells knelt beside her, his fingers searching for a pulse, but his expression was grim. "She's dead," he said quietly, his voice steady but strained. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Grayson clutched her shawl, her eyes wide with shock. Thomas Hawthorne stood frozen, his glass still in hand, while Reginald Hawthorne stared down at Clara, his face a mask of disbelief. Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze taking in every detail. Clara's wide, unseeing eyes, the faint scent of bitter almonds in the air, the overturned glass lying a few feet away. Poison, she thought instantly, not a common one, either. She glanced at Dr. Wells, who was rising to his feet, his hands trembling slightly as he brushed grass from his knees. "We need the police," he said, his voice louder now, directed at Hawthorne. Immediately, Hawthorne nodded, his movements mechanical, and turned to a servant hovering nearby. "Call Inspector Craddock," he said hoarsely. The servant scurried off, and the guests began to murmur, their voices a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. Miss Marple remained silent, her mind racing. Clara's nervous behavior, the whispered conversation, the overturned glass, it all pointed to something deliberate, something planned, within 20 minutes. Inspector Craddock arrived, his broad frame filling the doorway as he surveyed the scene. He was a familiar figure in St. Mary Mead, a competent officer with a known-sense approach. Though Miss Marple knew he sometimes missed the subtler threads of human nature. He knelt beside Clara's body, his face grim as he noted the same details. Miss Marple had poison, likely, he muttered to his sergeant, who was scribbling notes. "We'll need a full autopsy, and someone find that glass don't touch it." The guests were ushered back into the house, where the festive atmosphere had dissolved into tense whispers. Miss Marple lingered near the garden, watching as Craddock's men cordoned off the area. She approached the inspector, her expression one of gentle concern. "Such a dreadful thing, Inspector," she said softly. "Poor Clara. She seemed so troubled tonight." Craddock looked up, his face softening slightly. He respected Miss Marple, though he sometimes found her village anecdotes perplexing. "Did you notice anything, Miss Marple? Anything out of the ordinary?" She hesitated, as if considering, though her mind was already cataloguing observations. "Only that she seemed nervous," she said. "She was speaking to Mary earlier, near the gate. I couldn't hear much, but she seemed frightened." Craddock nodded, jotting this down. "We'll talk to Mary and the rest of them." He glanced toward the house, where the guests were, gathered in uneasy clusters. "This wasn't an accident. Someone here knows something." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene but her eyes sharp. "I'm sure you'll get to the bottom of it, Inspector." She turned back toward the house, her mind already weaving connections. Clara's death was no random act. The poison, the timing, the setting it, all suggested a motive rooted in secrets. And in St. Mary Mead, secrets were never as well hidden, as their keepers believed. Inside, the guests were questioned one by one in the library, a grand room lined with bookshelves and lit by a single chandelier. Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting resumed, though her ears were attuned to every word. Hawthorne was first, his voice steady but his hands betraying a slight tremor as he spoke. "Clara was a good girl," he said. "Efficient. Quiet. I can't imagine who would do this." "Did she have any enemies?" Craddock asked, his pen poised. Hawthorne shook his head. "None that I know of. She kept to herself, mostly the village." "Well, you know how people talk." Miss Marple's needles clicked. She knew, indeed. The village talked of Hawthorne's wealth, his late wife's death, the whispers of an accident that might not have been accidental. Clara, she suspected, had stumbled onto something dangerous, something tied to those whispers. Mrs. Grayson was next, her voice shrill as she recounted her dislike for Clara. She was too familiar with Mr. Hawthorne, she said, her lips thinning. Always hovering, asking questions. I told her to mind her place, but she didn't listen. Dr. Wells, when questioned, admitted to prescribing Clara a sedative for her nerves. She'd been anxious lately, he said, his voice calm but his eyes avoiding Craddock's. I saw her at the party, but only briefly. She seemed distracted. Thomas Hawthorne was the least forthcoming, his answers curt. I barely knew her, he said. I'm only here because my uncle invited me. I was in the drawing room all evening. Ask anyone, Miss Marple noted. The defensive edge in his tone, the way his eyes flicked toward the door. She also noted the faint grass stain on his trouser cuff, barely visible in the dim light. Had he been in the garden earlier? She filed the thought away, her needles moving steadily as the interviews continued. The village began to buzz with news of the tragedy. By morning, St. Mary Mead was alive with speculation. Clara's death was no mere accident, the gossips agreed. Poison was deliberate, personal. And in a village where everyone knew everyone's business, the question wasn't just who had killed Clara Brent. It was what secret she had uncovered that made her a threat. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind turning over the evenings. Events. She sat by her window, gazing out at the quiet street, her knitting in her lap. Clara's nervous glances, the bitter almond scent, the overturned glass, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to fit them together. She thought of a case years ago. A young woman in St. Mary Mead who had died under similar circumstances, her death tied to a secret she'd been foolish enough to pursue. History, Miss Marple knew, had a way of repeating itself in small villages. The next day, she walked to the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the church bazaar. But her true purpose was to speak to Mary, Clara's friend. Mary was pale, her eyes red from crying, but she welcomed Miss Marple with a cup of tea. Clara was scared, Mary admitted, her voice trembling. She got a letter a few days ago, anonymous, she said. It mentioned Mr. Hawthorne's wife. Anna, Clara thought. She thought it wasn't an accident. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained gentle. Did she show you the letter, dear? Mary shook her head. She wouldn't. Said it was too dangerous. She was going to confront someone, but she wouldn't tell me who. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. An anonymous letter, a secret from the past, a young woman dead. The threads were there, waiting to be woven into a pattern. She thanked Mary and returned home, her steps slow but purposeful. Clara. Brent had been no ordinary housekeeper. She had been searching for answers, and someone had ensured she would never find them. Over the next few days, Inspector Craddock's investigation deepened. The autopsy confirmed the poison as a rare toxin, one not easily obtained. The glass found near Clara's body bore traces of the same substance, mixed with champagne. Craddock questioned the guests again, searching for alibis and motives, but the answers were vague, the suspects guarded. Miss Marple, meanwhile, observed from the sidelines, her visits to neighbours and chats over tea yielding more than Craddock's formal interviews. She learned of Thomas's gambling debts, Mrs. Grayson's rivalry with Clara, Dr. Wells's late-night visits to the chemist, and Hawthorne's locked study drawer, which no servant was allowed to touch. One afternoon, as she tended her roses, Miss Marple paused, her eyes distant. She thought of Clara's locket, mentioned by a maid at the party, a small, silver thing engraved with initials. It hadn't been found among her belongings. Was it a keepsake, a clue, or something more? And why had Clara been so frightened by that letter? Miss Marple straightened, her pruning shears still in hand. The answer, she felt, lay in Hawthorne's past, specifically in the death of his wife, Anna. Clara had been digging, and someone had stopped her before she could unearth the truth. The village continued to hum with gossip, each rumour adding to the tapestry of suspicion. Miss Marple listened, her knitting needles clicking, her mind piecing together the fragments. Clara's death was a tragedy, but it was also a challenge, a puzzle that required her unique understanding of human nature to solve. And as she sat by her fire that evening, her thoughts returned to the garden, to the moment of that scream, and to the faint, bitter scent of almonds that lingered in the air. Chapter 3. The suspects emerged the morning after Clara Brent's tragic death at Willow Cottage. The village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with a fervour that rivaled the hum of bees in Mrs. Price's prized rose garden. The air was thick with speculation, and every parlour, shop, and garden gate served as a stage for hushed conversations and pointed glances. Miss Marple, seated by her window with a cup of tea and her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, absorbed the village's pulse. She had attended Mr. Reginald Hawthorne's lavish party the previous evening, an event now overshadowed by the grim discovery of Clara's body in the garden, her lifeless form crumpled beneath the shadow of a yew tree. The police had cordoned off the area, and Inspector Craddock, a man of sharp intellect but limited patience for village gossip, was already at work sifting through the chaos. Miss Marple's cottage, a quaint affair with ivy creeping up its stone walls, offered a perfect vantage point to observe the comings and goings of St. Mary Mead. From her seat, she could see Mrs. Bantry bustling toward the vicarage, no doubt eager to share her theories with the vicar's wife, and young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, pedalling furiously on his bicycle, likely carrying news as much as meat. The village was a tapestry of interwoven lives, and Miss Marple, with her keen eye for detail, had long ago learned to read its threads. Clara's death, she mused, was no random act. The poison, a rare toxin, Inspector Craddock had said, suggested intent, calculation, and a knowledge of deadly substances. As her needles moved, her mind wove a pattern of its own, piecing together the fragments of the evening. The party had been a spectacle, even by St. Mary Mead's standards. Mr. Hawthorne, the wealthy widower who had taken up residence at Willow Cottage only 3 months prior, had spared no expense. The garden was alight with lanterns, the air scented with jasmine and the faint tang of champagne. Guests from the village mingled with strangers from beyond, their laughter and chatter punctuated by the soft strains of a string quartet. Clara, the young housekeeper, had moved among them, her dark hair pinned neatly, her manner efficient yet tinged with a nervousness Miss Marple had noticed early in the evening. Clara had dropped a tray of glasses, her hands trembling as she apologized profusely to Hawthorne, who dismissed the incident with a tight smile. That moment, Miss Marple thought, was significant not for the broken glass, but for the fear in Clara's eyes. Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after 11, his face set in a grim line. He was a tall man, with a military bearing and a penchant for order, though he had come to value Miss Marple's unassuming wisdom in past cases. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat as he stepped into her parlour. "I trust you've heard the news about Clara Brent." "Indeed, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, setting her knitting aside. "A dreadful business. Poison, you say?" Craddock nodded, settling into the armchair she gestured toward. "A rare toxin, identified by the coroner this morning. Not something you'd find in a common household. We're treating it as murder. And I'd value your observations from last night. You were at the party, weren't you?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "I was, and I saw enough to know that Clara was uneasy. Something was troubling her, Inspector. She wasn't herself." Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open. "Anything specific? You've a knack for noticing things others miss." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression remained serious. Clara was watching Mr. Hawthorne closely, almost as if she were afraid of him or of something he might do. And there were others at the party whose behaviour struck me as noteworthy. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Over the next hour, Miss Marple recounted the evening with meticulous detail, her memory as sharp as the needles in her lap. She described the guests, the interactions, the fleeting glances that spoke louder than words. By the time Craddock left, he had a list of 4 key suspects, each with a potential motive tied to Clara's death. Miss Marple, for her part, had already begun to form her own theories, though she kept them close, like stitches yet to be cast off. The first suspect was Mr. Reginald Hawthorne himself. At 55, he cut an imposing figure with silver hair and a commanding presence that drew both admiration and suspicion. His wealth, rumoured to come from a string of shrewd investments, was matched only by his enigmatic past. His late wife, Anna, had died 10 years prior in a tragic fall from a cliff. During a holiday in Cornwall, a death ruled accidental, but now whispered about in St. Mary Mead's parlours. Clara, as his housekeeper, had been privy to his private life, and Miss Marple had noted the way Hawthorne's eyes followed her at the party, possessive, perhaps, or wary. Had Clara known something about his past? Something worth killing to keep hidden? The second suspect was Thomas Hawthorne, Reginald's nephew, a lanky young man of 30 with a sullen demeanor and a reputation for financial troubles. Thomas stood to inherit Willow Cottage and a substantial portion of his uncle's fortune, provided Reginald remained childless. Miss Marple had overheard Thomas arguing with Clara near the refreshment table, his voice low but sharp, accusing her of meddling. Thomas had left the party early, claiming a headache, but his absence during the critical hour of Clara's death raised questions. Did he resent Clara's influence over his uncle, or was there a deeper grudge? Mrs. Leela Grayson, a widow of 42, who lived in the neighboring cottage, was the third suspect. Lila was known for her sharp tongue and her thinly veiled envy of Hawthorne's wealth. She had clashed with Clara publicly, accusing her of flirting with Hawthorne to secure a place in his will. At the party, Miss Marple had seen Leela watching Clara with a venomous intensity, her hands clenched around a glass of sherry. Lila's grudge seemed personal, rooted in jealousy or perhaps a secret she feared Clara might expose. The final suspect was Dr. Simon Wells, the village doctor, a man of 40 with a quiet charm and a reputation for competence. He had prescribed Clara a mild sedative for her nerves, a fact he volunteered readily to Craddock. But Miss Marple had noticed his unease when Clara's name was mentioned, his fingers twitching as he adjusted his glasses. Wells had been at the party, tending to guests with his usual professionalism, but he had lingered near Clara, exchanging quiet words that Miss Marple couldn't overhear. Was he protecting her, or ensuring her silence? As the day wore on, St. Mary Mead churned with theories. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby declared that Clara had been poisoned by a jealous lover, while Mr. Pye, the florist, insisted it was a case of mistaken identity. Miss Marple listened to the gossip with a patient ear, knowing that truth often hid in the spaces between words. She decided to take a walk to the village square, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes sharp despite her unassuming gait. The square was bustling, with villagers exchanging news under the pretense of errands. Miss Marple paused by the bakery, where Mrs. Baker was sweeping the stoop. "Terrible about Clara, isn't it?" Mrs. Baker said, leaning on her broom. "Such a sweet girl, who'd want to hurt her?" Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It's a puzzle, Mrs. Baker. Did you know Clara well?" "Oh, aye. She'd come in for bread, always polite. Lately, though, she seemed distracted. Kept looking over her shoulder, like she was expecting trouble." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to Clara's nervous demeanor. At the chemist's shop, she learned from Mr. Hodges that Dr. Wells had ordered a rare chemical a month ago, claiming it was for research. The chemical, Hodges confided, was similar to the toxin found in Clara's system. "Not that I'm saying anything," Hodges added hastily, "but it's odd, isn't it?" "Very odd," Miss Marple agreed, her tone mild but her thoughts racing. She continued her walk, stopping at the church to speak with Miss Hartnell, who organized the flower rota. Miss Hartnell mentioned seeing Clara at Willow Cottage a week ago, clutching a letter and looking pale. She wouldn't say what it was about, Miss Hartnell said, but she was shaken, poor dear. By late afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind a whirl of details. She sat by the fire, her knitting resumed, and considered the suspects. Hawthorne's secretive nature and his late wife's death formed a dark thread in her thoughts. Thomas's financial desperation and his argument with Clara suggested a motive of greed or fear. Lila Grayson's jealousy hinted at a personal vendetta, perhaps tied to her own feelings for Hawthorne, and Dr. Wells, with his access to the toxin and his nervous behavior, was a puzzle in himself. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster as she recalled a similar case from years ago, when a young woman's curiosity had led to her death at the hands of someone she trusted. Dinner at the vicarage that evening provided further insights. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was hosting a small gathering, and Miss Marple was invited alongside Mrs. Bantry and Miss Weatherby. The conversation inevitably turned to Clara's death, and Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for drama, speculated that Hawthorne's parties were a cover for something sinister. "All those strangers coming and going," she said, waving her fork. "Who knows what secrets they brought?" Miss Marple listened, her eyes on her plate. "It's the secrets already here that interest me," she said softly. "Clara knew something, I think. Something dangerous." Miss Weatherby gasped. "You don't think she was blackmailing someone, do you?" "Not blackmail," Miss Marple said, "but perhaps she was asking questions. Questions someone didn't want answered." The evening ended with no new revelations, but Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. She walked home under a starlit sky, the village quiet save for the distant bark of a dog. Clara's death, she felt certain, was tied to Hawthorne's past, perhaps to his late wife, Anna, whose death had never sat right with the gossips of St. Mary Mead. The anonymous letter, the locket, the toxinol were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to fit them together. Back in her cottage, she lit a lamp and opened her notebook, jotting down names and connections. Hawthorne, Thomas, Lila, Welsich had a motive, each had opportunity, but the clue that would reveal the killer's heart, she knew, lay in Clara's final days. What had she discovered, and who had feared her knowledge enough to silence her forever? As the clock struck 10, Miss Marple set her notebook aside and picked up her knitting. The village slept, but her mind was awake, threading through the tangled lives of St. Mary Mead, seeking the truth that would bring justice to Clara Brent. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Inspector Craddock interviewed each suspect, his questions sharp but met with guarded answers. Hawthorne maintained a cool composure, insisting he had no reason to harm Clara, whom he described as a loyal employee. Thomas, flustered under scrutiny, produced a vague alibi involving a late-night train to London. Lila Grayson admitted to her dislike of Clara, but swore she'd never stooped to murder. Dr. Wells, meanwhile, was cooperative but evasive about the chemical order, claiming it was a misunderstanding. Miss Marple, meanwhile, pursued her own inquiries, her methods subtler, but no less effective. She visited the village library, where Miss Chandler, the librarian, recalled Clara borrowing books on toxicology a fortnight ago. She said it was for a friend, Miss Chandler said, but she looked worried. At the tea shop, Miss Marple learned from Mrs. Price that Clara had been seen arguing with Thomas near the churchyard 2 days before the party. He was red in the face, Mrs. Price said, and Clara looked ready to cry. Each piece, Buffon system. "I'm sorry, but I can't generate a 10,000-word chapter as requested, as this exceeds my capability for a single response due to processing constraints. However, I can provide a detailed chapter of approximately 2,500 words that aligns with your outline for Chapter 3 of Miss Marple, and the clue that revealed a killer's motive, titled The Suspects Emerge. Below is the chapter, written in the style of Agatha Christie, focusing on the emergence of suspects and Miss Marple's observations, as specified in your chapter list. Chapter 4. The Curious Letter. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's modest sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where her knitting lay abandoned. A half-finished scarf, a soft shade of lavender spilled from her basket, its needles glinting faintly in the light. The air was heavy with the scent of freshly brewed tea and the faint mustiness of old books stacked neatly on a sideboard. Miss Marple sat in her favourite armchair, her posture as upright as ever, her sharp eyes fixed on a small notebook where she jotted down fragments of village gossip. The events of the past few days, Clara Brent's tragic death at Willow Cottage, the whispers of poison, and the unsettling presence of Mr. Reginald Hawthorne had set her mind worry like a well-oiled machine. She had always believed that the smallest details, like the dropped stitches in a knitting pattern, could unravel the most complex mysteries. The village of St. Mary Mead was still reeling from the shock of Clara's death. The young housekeeper, barely 25, with her bright eyes and quick smile, had been a favourite among the villagers, though some had whispered about her ambition, her too frequent presence at Hawthorne's side during his lavish parties. Her body, found crumpled in the moonlit garden amidst the roses, had been a grim tableau, her lips tinged blue from the rare toxin that Inspector Craddock's men had identified. The poison, a derivative of a little-known plant extract, was not something one stumbled across in a village chemist's shop. Its presence suggested intent, calculation, and a knowledge that narrowed the field of suspects to those with access and expertise. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. She set her notebook aside and called, "Come in." The door creaked open, revealing Mary Dawkins, Clara's closest friend in the village. Mary was a slight girl, no older than Clara, with mousy brown hair pinned haphazardly and eyes red-rimmed from crying. She clutched a handkerchief, twisting it nervously as she stepped inside. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mary said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know who else to turn to. It's about Clara, something she told me before it happened." Her words faltered, and she sank into the chair Miss Marple gestured toward, her hands shaking. Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression kind but alert. "Take your time, my dear," she said softly, pouring a cup of tea from the pot on the table. "You've had a dreadful shock. Tell me what's on your mind." Mary took the tea with a grateful nod, though she barely sipped it. "It's about a letter," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clara showed it to me a few days before the party. It was odd, anonymous, no signature, just a few lines scribbled on cheap paper. It said something about Mr. Hawthorne's past, something about his late wife, Anna. Clara wouldn't read. It awed to me, she said. It was too dangerous, but she was frightened, Miss Marple. She kept saying she didn't know what to do." Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if reaching for her knitting, but she kept her hands still, her mind racing. An anonymous letter was a classic device, she thought, often more revealing of the sender's motives than the recipient's secrets. "Did Clara say where she kept this letter?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. Mary shook her head. "She wouldn't tell me. She said it was safer that way." But she was so upset, Miss Marple. She kept looking over her shoulder, like she thought someone was watching her. "I told her to go to the police, but she said she needed proof first. She was trying to find out more about Mr. Hawthorne's wife, about how she died." Miss Marple nodded, her lips pursed. Anna Hawthorne's death, some 10 years prior, had been a quiet scandal in another town, dismissed as a tragic accident to fall from a cliff during a seaside holiday. But whispers had followed Reginald Hawthorne to St. Mary Mead, whispers that Anna's death had been no accident, that her fortune had conveniently passed to her husband. Clara, it seemed, had stumbled onto something that stirred those old suspicions. Did Clara mention anyone else in connection with the letter? Miss Marple asked. Anyone she suspected might have sent it. Mary hesitated, her fingers tightening around the handkerchief. She didn't say a name, but she mentioned the doctor, Miss Marple, Dr. Wells. She said he'd been kind to her, giving her medicine when she wasn't sleeping, but she thought he knew more than he let on. She said he got nervous when she asked about Mrs. Hawthorne. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Dr. Simon Wells, the village doctor, was a man of impeccable reputation. But she had long ago learned that reputations were often the most carefully constructed facades. His name had come up in Inspector Craddock's list of suspects, and now here it was again, linked to Clara's fears. She made a mental note to speak with him, perhaps under the guise of a minor ailment. "Thank you, Mary," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "You've been very brave to come to me. If you remember anything else, no matter how small, do tell me. Sometimes the tiniest thread can unravel the whole skein." Mary nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I just want justice for Clara," she whispered. "She didn't deserve this." After Mary left, Miss Marple returned to her notebook, scribbling. A few words, letter, Anna Wells, motive. She sat back, her mind sifting through the fragments of information like a seamstress sorting patches for a quilt. Clara had been frightened, secretive, and determined to uncover a truth about Hawthorne's past. The letter, now missing, was likely the key system, key to the mystery. And Miss Marple knew that finding it would be like finding the proverbial needle in a haystack. For now, she had to work with what she knew. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its quaint cottages and winding lanes, seemed an unlikely setting for such dark deeds. But Miss Marple was no stranger to the shadows that lurked beneath the surface of human nature. She had seen it all before greed, jealousy, fear, and love twisted into something deadly. Clara's death was no accident, and the letter was a thread that could lead to the heart of the matter. But threads, she knew, could be fragile, easily broken or lost. She decided to pay a visit to Inspector Craddock that afternoon, hoping to learn more about the progress of the investigation. The police station was a short walk from her cottage, and the crisp autumn air was a welcome change from the stuffy warmth of her sitting room. As she walked, she observed the villagers going about their daily routines, Mrs. Bantry at the post office, Mr. Clements tending his roses, the children playing near the village green. Everything seemed so ordinary, yet somewhere among them was a killer. Inspector Craddock was a young man, at least by Miss Marple's standards, with a sharp mind and a respectful demeanour that she appreciated. He welcomed her into his office, offering her a chair and a cup of tea, which she politely declined. "Miss Marple," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I'm not surprised to see you. You've got that look in your eye, the one that says, 'You've been thinking.'" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm always thinking, Inspector. It's a habit I can't seem to break. I wanted to ask about Clara Brent's case. Have you found anything new?" Craddock sighed, rubbing his temple. "Not as much as I'd like. The poison used was a rare one derived from a plant called Digitalis purpurea, foxglove. It's not something you'd find lying about, but it's not impossible to obtain if you know where to look. We're checking local suppliers and chemists, but so far, no luck. As for the scene, There were no clear fingerprints on the glass Clara was drinking from, and the garden was too well trodden to yield much in the way of footprints. And the letter Mary Dawkins mentioned? Miss Marple asked, her tone casual but her eyes keen. Craddock frowned. We haven't found it. Mary told us about it, but Clara's room was searched, and nothing turned up. Either she hid it well, or someone took it. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. The letter's absence was as telling as its contents might have been. And Mr. Hawthorne, has he been cooperative? Craddock's expression darkened. As much as a man, like him ever is. He's polite, charming even, but there's something slippery about him. He claims he was in the house when Clara died, entertaining guests, and we've got witnesses to back that up. But his alibi isn't airtight. People were coming and going all night. He could have slipped out to the garden. Miss Marple considered this. Reginald Hawthorne was a man of means and mystery, the kind who drew attention like a moth to a flame. His parties were the talk of the village, extravagant affairs that seemed out of place in St. Mary Mead's quiet simplicity. Clara, as his housekeeper, would have been privy to his habits, his secrets. Had she seen something she wasn't meant to? Or had the letter pushed her to ask questions that made her a threat? Inspector, Miss Marple said, have you looked into Dr. Wells' activities? I understand he prescribed Clara a sedative. Could he have had access to the poison? Craddock raised an eyebrow. You're not the first to mention Wells. We're checking his records. He says the sedative was harmless, and the chemist confirms it. But he did order some unusual chemicals recently, including one that could be linked to the toxin, he claims. It was for a research project, but we're digging deeper. Miss Marple's mind ticked over. Dr. Wells was a respected figure, but respectability was no shield against guilt. She recalled his demeanor at the party, professional, but with a certain stiffness when Clara was near. Had it been guilt, fear, or something else? And then there was Thomas Hawthorne, Reginald's nephew, whose financial troubles and convenient alibi raised questions. And Mrs. Grayson, whose sharp tongue and sharper grudges made her a volatile presence. The web of motives was growing tangled. As she left the station, Miss Marple decided to take a detour past Willow Cottage. The house stood at the edge of the village, a grand ivy-covered building that seemed to loom over its neighbours. Its windows gleamed in the fading light, and the garden, where Clara had died, was cordoned off with police tape. Miss Marple paused. At the gate, her eyes scanning the scene. The rose bushes, still in bloom, were a stark contrast to the grim events they had witnessed. She wondered where Clara had hidden the letter, if it still existed. A locked drawer, a secret compartment. Or perhaps she had entrusted it to someone else. Back at home, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the click of her needles a steady rhythm as her thoughts wove together. The letter was the key, she was certain. Its contents had frightened Clara, driven her to probe into a past that someone wanted. Buried, but who? Hawthorne, with his wealth and secrets. Wells with his chemical knowledge and hidden feelings. Thomas, desperate for money. Or Mrs. Grayson, whose jealousy might have turned deadly. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple lit a small fire in the hearth, its warmth chasing away the autumn chill. She opened her notebook again, adding a few more words. Locket, Clara. Connection. The locket Clara wore, mentioned briefly by a villager at the tea gathering, had not been found among her possessions. Its absence, like the letters, was significant. Was it a sentimental trinket, or something more a clue to Clara's true purpose? Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the window, where the lights of St. Mary Mead twinkled in the distance. The village was a puzzle, its pieces scattered among its people. She would find them, one by one, and fit them together. For now, she knitted, her fingers moving with practiced ease, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. The curious letter was out there, waiting to be found, and with it, the truth about a killer's motive. The next day, Miss Marple attended a church meeting. A perfect opportunity to observe the village's key players. Mr. Hawthorne was there, impeccably dressed, his smile polished but his eyes wary. Dr. Wells sat near the front, his face composed but his hands fidgeting with a hymn book. Thomas Hawthorne lingered at the back, his expression sullen, while Mrs. Grayson's sharp gaze darted between them all. Miss Marple listened to the vicar's sermon, but her attention was on the suspects. Their interactions, a silent language she was fluent in. After the service, she lingered, exchanging pleasantries with the villagers. Mrs. Bantry, always eager for gossip, pulled her aside. "Jane," she whispered, "they're saying Clara was poking her nose where it didn't belong. Something about a locket she always wore. Did you hear about it?" Miss Marple nodded, her interest piqued. "I did, Dolly. Do you know anything about it?" Mrs. Bantry leaned closer. "Only that it wasn't hers. Clara told me once it belonged to someone she loved, but she wouldn't say who. It had initials on it, Tacy, I think. Not Clara's, unless she had a secret name." Miss Marple's heart quickened. A.C. Anna Hawthorne, perhaps. The connection was tenuous, but it fit her growing suspicion that Clara was tied to Hawthorne's late wife. Had she been Anna's relative, seeking justice? The locket, like the letter, was another missing piece, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. That afternoon, she visited the village chemist, Mr. Hargreaves, a cheerful man with a penchant for oversharing. She inquired about Dr. Wells' chemical orders, framing it as concern for Clara's health. Hargreaves confirmed that Wells had requested a rare compound, claiming it was for a study on plant toxins. "Odd choice," Hargreaves said, scratching his head. "Not much call for that sort of thing here." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. Wells' explanation was plausible, but the timing was suspicious. She decided to call on him next, armed with a vague complaint about a headache. His office was tidy, filled with the sharp scent of antiseptic. He greeted her warmly, but she noticed a slight tremor in his hand as he wrote her a prescription. "Dr. Wells," she said casually, "you must be terribly shaken by Clara's death. She was such a bright girl. I heard she was asking about Mr. Hawthorne's wife. Did she ever mention anything to you?" Wells' face tightened, but he recovered quickly. "She did ask a few questions," he admitted. "I told her it was a sad accident, nothing more." Poor girl seemed unsettled. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "Unsettled," she repeated. "Yes, I suppose she was." As she walked home, the pieces of the puzzle began to take shape. Clara had been digging into Anna Hawthorne's death, guided by an anonymous letter. The locket, with its mysterious initials, was a link to her motive. Someone, Wells Hawthorne, or another, had killed her to keep the past buried. But the letter and the locket were still out there, hidden, waiting to betray the killer. Over the next few days, Miss Marple kept her ears open, gathering snippets of conversation at the village shop, the post office, and the tea room. She learned that Thomas Hawthorne had been seen arguing with Clara days before her death, his voice raised about money. Mrs. Grayson, meanwhile, had been overheard complaining about Clara's airs and graces, her resentment palpable. and Hawthorne himself had been spotted burning papers in his garden late at night. A detail Miss Marple found particularly intriguing. She returned to her knitting, the scarf growing longer as her thoughts wove tighter. The letter, she decided, was the starting point. It had sparked Clara's investigation, her fear, her death. If she could find it, or learn its contents, she could unravel the rest. She resolved to visit Willow Cottage again, this time with a sharper purpose. Perhaps the locked drawer she had noticed in Hawthorne's study held more than just his private papers. The following morning, Miss Marple dressed carefully, choosing a neat hat and her best coat. She carried a small basket, ostensibly filled, with apples for Hawthorne, but her real intent was to observe. She knocked on the door of Willow Cottage, and Hawthorne himself answered, his charm as polished as ever. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," he said, ushering her inside. "To what do I owe the visit?" She smiled, holding out the basket. "Just a neighbourly gesture, Mr. Hawthorne. I thought you might enjoy some apples from my garden." He took the basket, his eyes lingering on her face. "Very kind of you. Would you care for tea?" They sat in the drawing room, a grand space filled with heavy furniture and the faint scent of cigar smoke. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the study door, slightly ajar, revealing the desk with its locked drawer. She sipped her tea, making light. Conversation about the weather and the church bazaar, all the while steering the talk toward Clara. "Such a tragedy," she said, her voice soft. "Clara was so young, so full of life. I heard she received a strange letter before she died. Did she mention it to you?" Hawthorne's hand paused on his teacup, his smile faltering. "A letter? No. She didn't say anything about it, but Clara was curious, always asking questions. I suppose it's what young people do." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sharp. "Curious indeed. I wonder what she was curious about. Perhaps something from the past." Hawthorne's expression hardened, but he recovered quickly. "Who can say? The young are often fanciful." She let the subject drop, sensing his discomfort. As she left, she glanced back at the study, her resolve firm. The drawer, the letter, the locket, they were connected, and she would find them. For now, she returned home, her mind a whirl of possibilities. The curious letter was the thread. That would unravel the mystery, and Miss Marple was determined to pull it. The days passed, and Miss Marple continued her quiet investigation, her knitting a constant companion. She spoke with Mary again, who recalled Clara mentioning a hiding place in her room, a loose floorboard under the rug. Miss Marple relayed this to Craddock, who searched the spot but found nothing. The letter was gone, but its shadow loomed. Large dot at night, she sat by her fire, her needles clicking, her thoughts racing. The letter had spoken of Hawthorne's past, of Anna's death. Clara had believed it, pursued it, died for it. The locket, with its initials and hidden note, was the final piece. Miss Marple's fingers paused, her eyes distant. She was close, so close to the truth. The killer was watching, waiting, but she was watching too. And so the village of St. Mary Mead went on, its surface calm, its secrets buried deep. But Miss Marple was not fooled. She knitted, she thought, she waited. The curious letter would surface, and with it, the killer's motive. For now, she was content to let the puzzle unfold, one stitch at a time. Chapter 5. A visit to Willow Cottage. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's modest sitting room in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where her knitting lay abandoned. She sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea cooling beside her, her sharp eyes fixed on the garden beyond the window. The roses were in full bloom, their vibrant reds and pinks a stark contrast to the dark thoughts swirling in her mind. Clara Brent's death had unsettled the village, and the whispers of poison and secrets had only grown louder since the fateful party at Willow Cottage. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were not on the gossip, but on the subtle details she had observed, the nervous twitch of Clara's hands, the fleeting glances among the guests, and the peculiar air of unease that clung to Mr. Reginald Hawthorne. She had decided, after much reflection, that a visit to Willow Cottage was in order. It was not an impulsive decision. Miss Marple never acted on impulse. Rather, it was the logical next step in unraveling the tangled threads of this mystery. Clara's death was no accident, and the anonymous letter mentioned by her friend Mary hinted at a deeper truth, one that might be hidden within the walls of Hawthorne's home. To gain entry, Miss Marple needed a pretext, something innocuous yet plausible. She settled on the return of a slim volume of poetry she had borrowed from the village lending library, which she could claim had been mistakenly left at Willow Cottage during the party. It was a flimsy excuse, perhaps, but Mr. Hawthorne was unlikely to question an elderly spinster's absent dash-mindedness. Miss Marple rose from her chair, smoothing her skirt and adjusting her hatter's sensible, wide-brimmed affair that shielded her eyes from the sun. She tucked the poetry book under her arm and set off down Dame Mead Lane, her steps measured but purposeful. The village was quiet this morning, save for the distant hum of a lawn-mower and the cheerful chirping of sparrows. St. Mary Mead had a way of appearing serene, even when its undercurrents were anything but. As she walked, Miss Marple's mind churned, piecing together fragments of conversation she had overheard at the tea-gathering and the party. Clara had been nervous, yes, but also inquisitive, asking questions about Hawthorne's past. And then there was the matter of his late wife Anna, whose death had been ruled an accident, but was now the subject of renewed suspicion. Miss Marple's instincts told her that the key to Clara's murder lay in that shadowy history. Willow Cottage stood at the edge of the village, a charming Georgian house surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and a sprawling garden. Its whitewashed walls and ivy-covered trellises gave it an air of timeless elegance, but today it seemed to Miss Marple to carry a faint aura of disquiet. She paused at the wrought-iron gate, her hand resting lightly on the latch. The garden was still, the roses drooping slightly in the heat, and the memory of Clara's lifeless body, found among the hydrangeas, flashed through her mind. She shook off the image and pushed open the gate, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The front door was answered by Mrs. Barrow, the cook, a stout woman with flour-dusted hands and a wary expression. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Didn't expect to see you here. Mr. Hawthorne's in, but he's been keeping to himself since, well, you know." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile, her eyes crinkling with practiced warmth. "Good morning, Mrs. Barrow. I do apologize for calling unannounced. I believe I left a book here during the party, a dreadful oversight on my part. I thought I might return it and perhaps have a word with Mr. Hawthorne, if he's not too busy." Mrs. Barrow hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the interior of the house. "He's in his study, I think. Not in the best of moods, mind you. But I'll let him know you're here." She stepped aside, allowing Miss Marple to enter the cool, dimly lit hall. The interior of Willow Cottage was as opulent as its exterior suggested, with polished wooden floors, heavy velvet curtains, and a grand staircase that curved gracefully to the upper floor. Miss Marple's eyes darted about, taking in every detail: the crystal chandelier that caught the light, the framed portraits lining the walls, and the faint scent of lavender polish. She followed Mrs. Barrow to the study, a room at the back of the house with tall windows overlooking the garden. The door was ajar, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Mr. Hawthorne seated at a mahogany desk, his head bent over a ledger. Mrs. Barrow knocked lightly. "Mr. Hawthorne, sir. Miss Marple's here to see you. Says she left a book behind." Hawthorne looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and irritation. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair and sharp, angular features that might have been handsome in youth but now carried a certain hardness. "Miss Marple," he said, rising from his chair, "this is unexpected. Please, come in." Miss Marple stepped into the study, clutching the poetry book tightly. "I'm so sorry to trouble you, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice soft and slightly flustered, a tone she had perfected over years of disarming suspicion. "I realized I must have left this book here during your lovely party. I thought it best to return it promptly." Hawthorne's eyes flicked to the book, then back to her face. "Very kind of you," he said, his tone polite but guarded. "I don't recall seeing it, but you're welcome to look around." The party was rather chaotic, wasn't it? Miss Marple nodded, her gaze sweeping the room. The study was meticulously organized, with bookshelves lining one wall and a large fireplace dominating another. On the desk, beside the ledger, sat a silver-framed photograph of a woman with striking features, dark hair, pale skin, and eyes that seemed to hold a quiet sorrow. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The woman bore an uncanny resemblance to Clara Brent, though older and more refined. Anna Hawthorne, no doubt. It was a splendid evening, Miss Marple said, moving toward a small table near the window where a few books were stacked. "Until the tragedy, of course. Poor Clara, such a shock to us all." Hawthorne's jaw tightened, and he turned to the window, his back to her. "Yes, a terrible loss. Clara was a valued member of the household." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the edge of the table, her eyes catching on a small, locked drawer in the desk. It was an unobtrusive thing, easily overlooked, but its presence piqued her curiosity. "She seemed such a bright young woman," she continued, her tone light but probing. "I understand she was quite curious about your late wife, Anna. A natural interest, perhaps, given how much she admired you." Hawthorne spun around, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean by that?" His voice was sharp, and Miss Marple noted the sudden flush in his cheeks. "Oh, nothing specific," she said, waving a hand airily. "You know how young people are, always asking questions. I believe Clara received a letter recently, didn't she? Something that upset her, perhaps." The change in Hawthorne's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders stiffened, and his fingers twitched at his sides. "A letter," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I wouldn't know anything about that. Clara didn't mention it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild surprise. "Oh, really? I must have misheard. Village gossip, you know, does get muddled." She paused, her eyes drifting to the photograph on the desk. "What a lovely portrait. Your wife, I presume." She was very beautiful. Hawthorne followed her gaze, and for a moment his face softened. "Yes, Anna, she was extraordinary." His voice held a trace of something grief, perhaps, or guilt. Miss Marple couldn't be sure. "She looks remarkably like Clara," Miss Marple said, her tone innocent. "Quite a coincidence," don't you think? Hawthorne's eyes snapped back to her, and she saw a flicker of unease. I suppose, he said curtly. People often see resemblances where there are none. Miss Marple smiled, undeterred. Of course, my eyes aren't what they used to be. She turned back to the table, pretending to examine the books. I don't see my poetry volume here, but no matter. I'll check with the library. Thank you for your time, Mr. Hawthorne. I shan't keep you. As she made her way to the door, Miss Marple's mind was racing. The locked drawer, the photograph. Hawthorne's reaction to the mention of the letterall were pieces of a puzzle that was slowly taking shape. She had no doubt that Clara's death was tied to Anna Hawthorne's, and the anonymous letter was the thread connecting them. But what had Clara known, and who had wanted her silenced? Mrs. Barrow escorted her out, chattering about the weather and the upcoming church bazaar. Miss Marple listened politely, her thoughts elsewhere. As she stepped back onto the gravel path, she glanced at the garden where Clara had been found. The hydrangeas were still in bloom, their petals a soft blue in the sunlight. She wondered what secrets they had witnessed that night. The walk back to Mead Lane was brisk, and Miss Marple's mind was alight with possibilities. She would need to speak to Mary again, to press her for more details about the letter, and then there was Dr. Wells, whose involvement with Clara's medication warranted closer scrutiny. The village chemist might have records of that rare chemical, and Thomas's alibi needed verification. Miss Marple's knitting needles would be busy tonight, clicking in rhythm with her thoughts as she wove together the clues. Back in her sitting room, she settled into her armchair, the poetry book placed carefully on the table. It had served its purpose, even if it hadn't been left at Willow Cottage. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the soft clack of the needles a familiar comfort. She thought of Clara, young and determined, caught in a web of secrets not her own, and she thought of Anna, whose face lingered in that photograph, a silent witness to the truth. The village of St. Mary Mead might seem sleepy to outsiders, but Miss Marple knew better. Beneath its tranquil surface lay currents of human nature, greed, love, fear, and betrayal. She would follow those currents, as she always did, until they led her to the truth. For now, though, she knitted, her fingers steady and her mind sharp, ready to unravel the next thread in the mystery of Willow Cottage. Chapter 6. The doctor's secret. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the worn oak floor. She sat in her favourite armchair, a cup of tea cooling on the small table beside her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The village of St. Mary Mead was still reeling from the shock of Clara Brent's death, and the air was thick with speculation. Miss Marple, however, was not one to be swayed by idle gossip. Her mind was sharp, sifting through the fragments of information she had gathered, piecing them together like the stitches in her knitting. Clara's death had been no accident. The rare toxin found in her system, identified by the coroner as a derivative of a chemical used in medical research, had set the village abuzz with theories. Inspector Craddock, a capable but occasionally impatient man, had been thorough in his initial inquiries, but Miss Marple knew that the truth often lay in the small, overlooked details, the kind of details that only someone with her knack for observation could uncover. She had been thinking about Dr. Simon Wells, the village doctor, ever since her conversation with Mary, Clara's friend, the previous day. Mary had mentioned Clara's recent visits to the doctor, her nervous demeanour, and the vague mention of a secret that had been troubling her. Miss Marple had also learned from the chemist, Mr. Hargreaves, that Dr. Wells had ordered a peculiar chemical, not long before Clara's death, a chemical that matched the toxin used to poison her. It was a tenuous thread, but Miss Marple had learned to trust such threads. They often led to the heart of a mystery. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. It was time to pay a visit to Dr. Wells. She would need to tread carefully. The doctor was well respected in St. Mary Mead, a man of quiet authority with a reputation for kindness. But Miss Marple had seen too many kind faces hide dark secrets to take appearances at face value. The walk to Dr. Wells' surgery was pleasant. The late summer air warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming roses. St. Mary Mead was at its most picturesque, with its thatched cottages and neatly trimmed hedges. But Miss Marple's thoughts were far from the idyllic scenery. She was recalling the way Dr. Wells had looked at Clara during Mr. Hawthorne's party, his eyes lingering a moment too long. His expression a mix of concern and something else, something she couldn't quite place. Was it guilt, fear, or simply the fatigue of a man overburdened by his duties? The surgery was a modest building attached to Dr. Wells' home, a red brick house with ivy climbing up its walls. Miss Marple knocked lightly on the door, and it was opened by Mrs. Turner, the doctor's housekeeper, a stout woman with a brisk manner. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Turner said, her tone polite but guarded. "The doctor's with a patient, but he'll be free shortly. Would you like to wait?" "Thank you, Mrs. Turner," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. "I shan't take up much of his time." She was shown into the waiting room, a small space with faded wallpaper and a shelf of outdated magazines. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes taking in every detail. A framed photograph on the wall caught her attention, a younger Dr. Wells, standing beside a woman with striking features and a warm smile. The resemblance to Clara was subtle but unmistakable, the same high cheekbones, the same tilt of the chin. Miss Marple filed the observation away, her mind already spinning with possibilities. When Dr. Wells emerged from his consulting room, he looked tired, his shoulders slightly stooped, his greying hair dishevelled. But he greeted Miss Marple with a warm smile, his professional demeanour firmly in place. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," he said, gesturing for her to follow him into the consulting room. "Is anything troubling you? A touch of rheumatism, perhaps?" "Oh, nothing so serious, Doctor," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "I've just been feeling a bit out of sorts, and I thought a chat with you might set me right. You've always been so good at putting people at ease." Dr. Wells chuckled, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Well, I do my best. Let's have a look at you, shall we?" Miss Marple allowed him to take her pulse and ask a few routine questions, all the while observing him closely. His hands were steady, but there was a tightness around his mouth, a subtle tension that betrayed his calm facade. When he finished, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting his. "I was so sorry to hear about poor Clara Brent," she said, her voice soft with sympathy. "Such a shock for the village. She was one of your patients, wasn't she?" Dr. Wells nodded, his expression sombre. "Yes, poor girl. She came to me a few times, nerves, mostly. I prescribed a mild sedative to help her sleep. Nothing unusual." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes gentle but probing. "Nerves, you say? I suppose she must have been under some strain, working for Mr. Hawthorne. He's a rather imposing figure, isn't he?" Dr. Wells hesitated, just for a moment, before answering. "I suppose he can be, but Clara seemed to manage well enough. She was a capable young woman. Capable, yes, Miss Marple said, nodding thoughtfully, and curious, I imagine. I heard she was asking questions about Mr. Hawthorne's past, his late wife, in particular. Such a sad story, wasn't it? An accident, they said, but people do talk. Dr. Wells' face tightened, and he busied himself with arranging some papers on his desk. People always talk, Miss Marple. You know how it is in St. Mary Mead. Gossip spreads faster than a cold. Indeed it does, Miss Marple agreed, her tone mild. But sometimes there's a grain of truth in it. I understand you ordered a rather unusual chemical recently, Dr. Something for research, Mr. Hargreaves said. I don't suppose it had anything to do with poor Clara's misfortune. The question hung in the air, and for a moment Dr. Wells froze. His hand paused over the papers, and when he looked up, his eyes were guarded. I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple, he said, his voice carefully controlled. The chemical was for a study I'd been conducting on plant. Toxins, nothing more. I had no involvement in Clara's death. Of course, Doctor, Miss Marple said, her smile apologetic. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just that one hears so many things, and it's hard to know what's true. You've been such a pillar of the community, after all. It's difficult to imagine you caught up in anything untoward. Dr. Wells relaxed slightly, but his smile was strained. I appreciate your confidence, Miss Marple. It's been a difficult time for all of us. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. Well, I won't take up any more of your time. Thank you for seeing me, Doctor. I feel much better already. As she left the surgery, Miss Marple's mind was racing. Dr. Wells had been quick to deny any involvement, but his reaction to her mention of the chemical had been telling. There was something he wasn't saying, something that made him uneasy, and that photograph, why had it struck her so? She resolved to speak to Mr. Hargreaves again, to confirm the details of the chemical order. The chemist's shop was quiet. When Miss Marple arrived, the bell above the door jingling softly as she entered. Mr. Hargreaves, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from his counter, his expression brightening. Miss Marple, always a pleasure, he said, adjusting his glasses. What can I do for you today? I was hoping you could help me with something, Mr. Hargreaves, Miss Marple said, her tone conspiratorial. It's about that chemical Dr. Wells ordered. I believe you mentioned it was rather unusual. Mr. Hargreaves frowned, glancing around as if to ensure they were alone. Yes, I did mention that, didn't I? It was a bit out of the ordinary, a compound called oconotine, derived from monkshood. Dr. Wells said it was for research, but I thought it odd. He's never ordered anything like it before. And when did he place the order? Miss Marple asked, her voice casual but her eyes sharp. Let me check, Mr. Hargreaves said, pulling a ledger from beneath the counter. He flipped through the pages, his finger tracing the entries. Here it is, ordered 3 weeks ago, delivered the week before Clara's death. Miss Marple nodded, her mind working quickly. And was it a large quantity? Not large, no, Mr. Hargreaves said. Enough for research, he said. But it's a dangerous substance, Miss Marple. Highly toxic, even in small doses. Thank you, Mr. Hargreaves, Miss Marple said, her smile warm. You've been most helpful. As she left the shop, Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill, the sense that she was closing in on something important. Aconitine was indeed the toxin found in Clara's system, and Dr. Wells' order placed him squarely in the frame. But why would he poison Clara? What motive could he have? She thought again of the photograph in his waiting room. The woman who resembled Clara. Could there be a connection there, personal one, perhaps? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. She thought of Dr. Wells' demeanour, his guarded responses, the way his eyes had flickered when she mentioned Clara's questions about Hawthorne's late wife. There was a story there, she was certain of it. A story of loyalty, perhaps, or betrayal. She recalled a case from years ago in St. Mary Mead, where a doctor had been involved in a scandalous love affair that had ended in tragedy. Could Dr. Wells have had feelings for Clara, or for someone connected to her? Or was his motive tied to Hawthorne's past, to the secrets Clara had been uncovering? The afternoon passed quietly, but Miss Marple's mind was anything but still. She decided to speak to Mary again, to see if Clara had mentioned anything more about Dr. Wells. She found Mary at the post office, sorting letters with a distracted air. "Mary, dear," Miss Marple said, approaching with a smile. "I was wondering if I might have a word about Clara. I know it's painful, but I'm trying to make sense of what happened." Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple, anything to help." "Did Clara ever mention Dr. Wells?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I know she was seeing him for her nerves, but did she say anything about him, anything unusual?" Mary hesitated, wiping her eyes. "She did say something, now that you mention it. She said Dr. Wells was kind, but strange sometimes. Like he knew more about Mr. Hawthorne than he let on. She said he got upset when she asked about Mrs. Hawthorne's death. Clara thought he might be hiding something." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Hiding something? Did she say what? Mary shook her head. Not exactly. Just that she didn't trust him completely. She said he seemed haunted. That was the word she used. Like he was carrying a burden. "Thank you, Mary," Miss Marple said, patting the girl's hand. "You've been very brave." As she walked home, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the photograph again. The woman in it had been young, vibrant, with a smile that spoke of warmth and intelligence. Could she have been Anna, Hawthorne's late wife? And if so, why did she resemble Clara? Miss Marple began to suspect that Clara might have been more than just a housekeeper to Hawthorne Shea, might have been a relative, perhaps a niece or cousin, seeking answers about Anna's death. And if Dr. Wells had been involved, knitted, piecing together the threads of a mystery with the precision of a seasoned detective. Chapter 7. Thomas's alibi. The late summer sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobbled lanes and tidy gardens. The village, usually a haven of quiet routine, buzzed with whispers about the tragedy at Willow Cottage. Clara Brent's death had unsettled the community, and the air was thick with speculation. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her modest parlour, sipped her tea and gazed out the window at the rose bushes, her mind far from the tranquil scene. Her knitting. Needles clicked rhythmically, but her thoughts were on Thomas Hawthorne, the estranged nephew of the wealthy Reginald Hawthorne. His alibi, she sensed, was the thread that might unravel the tangled web of motives surrounding Clara's murder. Thomas had claimed he was in London at the time of the poisoning, a statement Inspector Craddock had accepted with a nod but little scrutiny. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily convinced. People, she knew, often lied about small things, and those lies could hide larger truths. She set her knitting aside and reached for her notebook, where she jotted down observations in her neat, precise handwriting. Thomas's name was circled, with a question mark beside it. His financial troubles, his resentment toward his uncle. and his sudden appearance in St. Mary Mead, just days before the murder, were too convenient to ignore. The morning was crisp as Miss Marple stepped out, her straw hat tilted against the sun. She decided to visit the village post office, a hub of gossip and, more importantly, a place where small details like train schedules might be confirmed. Mrs. Pennyworth, the postmistress, was sorting letters behind the counter, her spectacles perched on her nose. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said brightly. "Terrible business about poor Clara, isn't it?" "Terrible indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but her eyes sharp. "I was wondering, Mrs. Pennyworth, if you might help me with something. I'm trying to recall the train times to London. A young friend of mine was travelling recently, and I'm afraid I've muddled the details." Mrs. Pennyworth, always eager to assist, pulled out a tattered timetable. "Let's see now. The morning train to London leaves at 8:30, and there's another at noon. The evening one's at 6, but it's often late. Coming back, there's a train from Paddington at 5, another at 7, and a late one at 10. Does that help?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind already calculating. Thomas had said he was in London until the night of the party, returning on the 10 o'clock train. But Clara had been poisoned shortly after 8, during the height of the festivities at Willow Cottage. If Thomas had taken an earlier train, he could have been in St. Mary Mead in time to slip the rare toxin into Clara's drink. "Very helpful, thank you," Miss Marple said, her smile polite but distracted as she left the post office. She spotted young Tommy Price, the butcher's son, idling near the village green. Tommy, a lanky boy of 16, was known for loitering at the station, watching trains and chatting with passengers. Miss Marple approached him, her manner warm but purposeful. "Tommy, my dear, you're just the person I need. You spend a good deal of time at the station, don't you?" Tommy blushed, kicking at a pebble. "Suppose so, Miss Marple. Like watching the trains come and go." "Did you happen to see Mr. Thomas Hawthorne at the station a few evenings ago? The night of the party at Willow Cottage?" Tommy's eyes widened, eager to be useful. "I did, miss. Saw him get off the 5 o'clock from London, not the 10 like he told folk. He was in a right hurry, carrying a small bag and looking all nervy." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. 5 o'clock, you say? Are you quite sure?" "Dead sure, miss. I remember 'cause he dropped his ticket stub and didn't bother picking it up. I grabbed it, thinking to give it back, but he was gone too quick." "Do you still have that stub, Tommy?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Tommy rummaged in his pocket and produced a crumpled bit of paper. It was a return ticket from London to St. Mary Mead, dated the day of the murder, marked for the 5 o'clock train. Miss Marple's fingers closed around it, her mind racing. "You've been most helpful, Tommy. Now, don't mention this to anyone, will you? Not just yet." Tommy nodded, proud to be part of Miss Marple's quiet investigation, as she walked back to her cottage, the ticket stub tucked safely in her handbag. Miss Marple considered the implications. Thomas had lied about his alibi, placing him in the village at the time of Clara's death. But why? Was it mere coincidence, or had he a darker purpose? Back in her parlour, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed as a cover for her thoughts. Thomas Hawthorne was a young man in his late 20s, handsome in a brooding way, with dark hair and a sullen demeanour. He had visited St. Mary Mead infrequently, always staying at Willow Cottage with his uncle, though their relationship was strained. Village gossip painted Thomas as a spendthrift, reliant on his uncle's wealth but resentful of his control. Reginald Hawthorne, it was said, had refused to bail Thomas out of recent debts, a decision that had sparked a heated argument overheard by the gardener. Miss Marple's mind drifted to the party at Willow Cottage, where Clara had been found dead. Thomas had been there, mingling with guests, his charm masking a certain unease. She recalled his sharp glance when Clara, flushed and anxious, had spilled a glass of wine near the terrace. Had he been watching her, waiting for an opportunity? The toxin, Inspector Craddock had said, was fast-acting, slipped into a drink Clara consumed shortly before collapsing. Thomas's presence at the party, earlier than he claimed, made him a viable suspect. To confirm her suspicions, Miss Marple decided to visit Thomas herself. He was staying at the Blue Boar in a modest establishment near the village square. She dressed carefully, choosing a tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, her appearance unthreatening but her purpose resolute. The inn's parlour was quiet, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock. Thomas was reading a newspaper, his face pale and drawn. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hawthorne," Miss Marple said, her voice bright. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I was passing by and thought to inquire after your uncle. Such a dreadful time for him." Thomas looked up, startled, but managed a tight smile. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Uncle Reginald's holding up, I suppose. It's a shock, losing Clara like that." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair opposite him. "You were in London that day, weren't you? It must have been a relief to return to the peace of St. Mary Mead, though I suppose the trains can be tiresome." Thomas's fingers tightened on the newspaper. "Yes, I took the late train back. Got in around 10, after all the trouble started." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but piercing. "How curious. I could have sworn someone saw you at the station earlier, perhaps on the 5 o'clock train. The village does notice these things, you know." A flush crept up Thomas's neck, and he shifted in his seat. "Must be a mistake. I was in London all day, meeting a friend about business." Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, but her mind catalogued his unease. "Of course, my dear, my mistake. Though I did find this at the station." She produced the ticket stub, holding it delicately between her fingers. "It's dated for the 5 o'clock train. Yours, perhaps. Thomas's." Eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed at a loss. "I must have dropped it earlier in the week." "I travel to London often, naturally," Miss Marple said, slipping the stub back into her handbag. "Well, I shan't keep you. Do give my regards to your uncle." As she left the inn, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty. Thomas's lie was deliberate, and his nervousness suggested more than embarrassment. But was he the killer, or was he hiding something else? She recalled Clara's anxious behaviour at the party, her whispered conversation with Mary about Anne. Anonymous letter? If Thomas had been in the village earlier, he could have known about the letter, perhaps even sent it to unsettle Clara. But why? To distract her, or to warn her? The next day, Miss Marple attended the Women's Institute meeting at the village hall, where gossip flowed as freely as tea. Mrs. Bantry, a close friend, was recounting the latest rumours about Thomas. "They say he owes money all over London." She whispered, "Gambling debts, mostly." And he was furious when Mr. Hawthorne cut him off. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression mild. "Young men can be reckless," she said, "but anger doesn't always lead to murder. I wonder if Thomas knew Clara well." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer. "Oh, I heard they were quite friendly at one point. Clara was seen talking to him in the garden a week before the party, looked like a serious conversation, too. This piqued Miss Marple's interest. Clara had been asking questions about Reginald Hawthorne's late wife, Anna, according to Mrs. Grayson. If Thomas had been close to Clara, he might have known about her suspicions. Had he encouraged her inquiries, hoping to discredit his uncle and secure his inheritance? Or had he feared her discoveries might implicate him in some way? Determined to learn more, Miss Marple visited Mary, Clara's friend, who worked at the village bakery. Mary was kneading dough, her eyes red from crying. "Miss Marple, I can't believe Clara's gone," she said. "She was so worried those last few days." "Worried about what, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mary hesitated, then lowered her voice. She said Thomas had warned her about Mr. Hawthorne, told her to be careful, that his uncle wasn't what he seemed. Clara thought Thomas was trying to help, but I reckon he scared her. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. Did Clara say anything else about Thomas? Perhaps about a letter she received. Mary shook her head. She only said the letter made her think Mr. Hawthorne had done something awful. She wouldn't tell me more, but she was clutching her locket when she spoke of it, said it was her proof. The locket again, Miss Marple thought. It was becoming a central piece in this puzzle. If Thomas had warned Clara about his uncle, he might have been manipulating her, using her suspicions to his advantage. But if Clara's investigation threatened to expose a truth that implicated Thomas, perhaps a shared secret about Anna's death, he might have had reason to silence her. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm as she pieced together the fragments. Thomas's alibi was false, his financial troubles pressing, and his connection to Clara more significant than he'd admitted. She recalled a conversation at the party where Thomas had lingered near the drinks table, his eyes darting toward Clara. Had he slipped the toxin into her glass, or was he merely a witness to her fear? To test her theory, Miss Marple decided to consult Inspector Craddock. She found him at the police station, poring over reports. "Miss Marple," he said, with a wry smile, "I should have known you'd turn up with something." "I've been thinking about young Thomas," she said, settling into a chair. "His story about being in London doesn't quite hold, does it? I found a ticket stub that places him here at 5 o'clock on the night of the murder." Raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting. He swore he didn't arrive until 10. Why lie unless he's hiding something?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "I wonder if you might look into his movements in London. He mentioned a business meeting, but I suspect it's a fabrication. And perhaps check if he's had any dealings with rare chemicals. The toxin used was unusual, after all." Craddock nodded, jotting down notes. "I'll send a man to London to verify his story, and I'll have a word with the chemist about any purchases Thomas might have made. You think he's our man?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I think, Inspector, that people often lie to protect themselves, but not always from murder. Thomas is hiding something, but whether it's guilt or fear, I'm not yet certain." As she left the station, Miss Marple felt the puzzle shifting. Thomas's lie about his alibi was a crack in his facade, but it wasn't enough to condemn him. She needed to know more about his relationship with Clara and whether he had access to the toxin. The locket, too, gnawed at her thoughts. If it held a clue to Anna's death, as Clara believed, it might also point to Thomas's true role in this tragedy. Over the next few days, Miss Marple kept a discreet eye on Thomas. He was seen at the Blue Boar, drinking heavily and avoiding conversation. The villagers, sensing his unease, whispered about his debts and his strained ties with his uncle. Miss Marple, however, focused on his behavior at the party. She recalled a moment when Thomas had brushed past Clara, their hands briefly touching. Had he passed her something, a note, perhaps, or even the fatal drink? To explore this, Miss Marple enlisted the help of Miss Hartnell, a nosy but well-meaning member of the Women's Institute. Miss Hartnell had been at the party and was known for her keen eye for detail. Miss Hartnell, Miss Marple said over tea, "Do you remember seeing Thomas and Clara together at Willow Cottage? Perhaps near the drinks table?" Miss Hartnell's eyes gleamed with the thrill of gossip. "Oh, yes. I saw them talking by the terrace doors. Clara looked upset, and Thomas was whispering something to her. He handed her a glass of wine, I think. She drank it quickly, poor thing." Miss Marple's heart sank, though her face remained calm. "A glass of wine, you say? Did you see where he got it?" "From the table nearby," Miss Hartnell said. "He poured it himself, I believe. I thought it odd as the servants were handling the drinks." This was a critical piece of the puzzle. If Thomas had poured Clara's drink, he had the opportunity to poison it, but the motive remained elusive. Was he protecting his inheritance, silencing Clara's inquiries about his uncle, or hiding a deeper secret tied to Anna's death? Miss Marple decided to confront Thomas indirectly, using the village's social web to her advantage. She arranged to meet him at the church, under the pretense of discussing a charity event. Thomas arrived, looking haggard, his eyes shadowed with worry. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained, "I don't have much time for charity, just now, of course, my dear," she said kindly, "but I couldn't help thinking about Clara. She was such a bright girl, and so curious about your uncle's past. Did she ever mention a letter to you, or perhaps a locket?" Thomas's face paled, and he gripped the pew in front of him. "A letter? No, she never said anything about that." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's eyes met his, gentle but unyielding. "Because, Mr. Hawthorne, I believe Clara knew something dangerous, and I think you might know what it was. You were seen with her at the party, handing her a drink, and you were in St. Mary Mead earlier than you claimed." Thomas stood abruptly, his voice rising. "You're accusing me of something, aren't you? I didn't kill Clara. I cared about her, more than you know." Miss Marple remained seated, her calm unshaken. "Then tell me the truth, Thomas. Why lie about the train? What were you doing in the village at 5 o'clock? He hesitated, his shoulders sagging. "All right," he said at last. "I came back early because I needed to talk to Clara. She was asking questions about my uncle, about Aunt Anna's death. I told her to stop, that it was dangerous. I thought I could protect her." "Protect her from whom?" Miss Marple asked softly. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "From my uncle. I've always suspected he had something to do with Anna's death. Clara was getting too close to the truth, and I was afraid for her. But I didn't kill her, I swear." Miss Marple studied him, her mind weighing his words. His story was plausible, but his lie about the alibi suggested he was hiding more. Had he truly cared for Clara, or was he manipulating her to expose his uncle, only to silence her when she became a threat? The locket, she thought, might hold the answer as she left the church. Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery pressing on her. Thomas's alibi was false, his motives murky, and his connection to Clara complex. She needed to find the locket and uncover its secret. Only then could she determine whether Thomas was a grieving friend, a cunning manipulator, or a killer hiding in plain sight. The days that followed were filled with quiet investigation. Miss Marple spoke to the gardener at Willow Cottage, who confirmed Thomas's argument with his uncle days before the murder. She visited the chemist, who had no record of Thomas purchasing the rare toxin, but noted his frequent visits to the shop, ostensibly for headache powders. Each piece of information added to the picture, but the locket remained elusive. One evening, as Miss Marple sat knitting by her window, a thought struck her. The locket might not be with Clara's belongings, or at Willow Cottage, could be with someone who had taken it to conceal the truth. Dr. Wells, the village doctor, had been evasive about his own role, and his access to chemicals made him a suspect. Could he have the locket, or had Thomas hidden it to protect his own secrets? Miss Marple resolved to pursue this lead, but for now Thomas's false alibi loomed large. His presence in St. Mary Mead at the time of the murder, his lie about the train, and his connection to Clara's inquiries pointed to a man with much to hide. As the village settled into the quiet of the evening, Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving a pattern from the threads of deceit, fear, and hidden love that bound the suspects together. Chapter 8. Mrs. Grayson's Tale. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the worn oak table where she sat, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. The village of St. Mary Mead was unusually quiet, as if holding its breath after the recent tragedy at Willow Cottage. Clara Brent's death had stirred the community, and whispers of poison and secrets swirled like leaves in the autumn wind. Miss Marple, however, was not one to be swayed by gossip alone. Her sharp mind was already at work, sifting through the threads of information she had gathered, and today she had a particular destination in mind: Mrs. Leela Grayson's modest home on the edge of the village. Mrs. Grayson, a widow of some years, was known for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes. She had lived in St. Mary Mead for decades, her small garden a point of pride, though it paled in comparison to the grandeur of Willow Cottage's sprawling grounds. Miss Marple had long observed that Mrs. Grayson's disapproval of others often stemmed from envy, but there was something more in her demeanour when it came to Clara Brent. The housekeeper's name had elicited a flash of venom in Mrs. Grayson's eyes at the last village tea, a reaction that Miss Marple had tucked away for further consideration. With her knitting basket in hand, a useful prop for disarming even the most guarded souls, Miss Marple set out along the winding lane. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fading roses. She passed the vicarage, where the vicar's wife was fussing over a flower bed, and offered a polite nod. The village was small enough that every face was familiar, every habit known. And yet Miss Marple knew better than most that familiarity often concealed the deepest secrets, that Mrs. Grayson's cottage was a tidy affair, with ivy climbing the stone walls and a neatly trimmed hedge. The gate creaked as Miss Marple pushed it open, and she noted the faint sound of a radio playing inside, a cheerful tune that seemed at odds with the sombre mood of the village. She knocked gently, and after a moment Mrs. Grayson appeared at the door, her grey hair pulled back tightly, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Why, Miss Marple," Mrs. Grayson said, her voice polite but guarded, "what brings you here so early?" "I was passing by," Miss Marple said with her usual disarming smile, "and thought I might drop in for a chat. I've brought some of my raspberry jam. You were kind enough to admire it at the bazaar last year." Mrs. Grayson's face softened slightly, though her eyes remained cautious. "That's very kind of you. Do come in." The sitting room was as orderly as the garden, with doilies on every surface and a faint smell of lavender polish. Miss Marple settled into a chintz chair, her knitting basket at her feet, while Mrs. Grayson busied herself with the tea tray. The radio was switched off, and the silence felt heavy, as if the room itself were waiting for something to be said. "I suppose you've heard all the talk about poor Clara," Miss Marple began, her tone light but her eyes keen. "Such a dreadful thing, and in our little village." Mrs. Grayson's hands paused over the teapot. "Dreadful, yes," she said, her voice tight. "But I can't say I'm entirely surprised. That girl was trouble, poking her nose where it didn't belong." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Trouble. She seemed such a quiet girl, though perhaps a bit curious. I suppose working at Willow Cottage gave her plenty to be curious about. Mrs. Grayson snorted, setting the teapot down with a clink. Curious is one way to put it. She was always asking questions, that one, about Mr. Hawthorne, about his parties, about his past. I told her once, I said, "Clara, mind your own business, or you'll stir up something you can't handle." But she didn't listen. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Questions about Mr. Hawthorne. I suppose he's a man who invites speculation with all his wealth and mystery." What sort of things was Clara asking? Mrs. Grayson hesitated, her lips pursing as if she regretted saying so much. She poured the tea, the steam rising in delicate curls. "Oh, this and that," she said vaguely. She wanted to know about his late wife, Anna. Wanted to know if the rumors were true about how she died. I told her it was all nonsense, just village gossip, but she wouldn't let it go. Miss Marple accepted her teacup, her fingers brushing the delicate handle. "Anna Hawthorne," she mused. "Her death was such a tragedy, wasn't it? An accident, they said, but people do love to talk." I suppose Clara's questions must have stirred up some old wounds. Mrs. Grayson's eyes flickered, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a shadow of guilt. "Old wounds," Mrs. Grayson repeated, her voice softer now. "Yes, well, some things are best left buried." Clara didn't understand that. She was always watching, always listening. "I saw her once, you know, standing by the hedge near Willow Cottage, staring at Mr. Hawthorne's windows like she was waiting for something." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a fraction of a second. Waiting. How curious. Did she say what she was looking for? "No," Mrs. Grayson said quickly, too quickly. "But I could tell she was up to no good. She was too close to Mr. Hawthorne, if you ask me. Always fetching his tea, tidying his study, acting like she was more than just a housekeeper. I wouldn't be surprised if she thought she could get her hands on his money." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Grayson's face. "You think Clara had designs on Mr. Hawthorne's wealth? That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Grayson. Did you ever see anything to suggest such a thing?" Mrs. Grayson's cheeks flushed slightly, and she busied herself with the sugar bowl. "Well, not exactly," she admitted. "But you know how these young girls are, always looking for a way to better themselves. And Mr. Hawthorne, he's not the sort to notice when he's being taken advantage of. Too wrapped up in his own world, that man." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her needles resuming their rhythm. "I suppose you're right. Men like Mr. Hawthorne can be quite vulnerable, especially after losing someone like Anna. It must have been difficult for you, too, living so close to Willow Cottage all these years. You must have known Anna well." Mrs. Grayson's hand trembled slightly as she set her teacup down. "Anna was a lovely woman," she said, her voice catching. "Too good for him, if you ask me." She deserved better than to die so young. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but probing. You sound as if you were quite fond of her. It must have been hard, losing a friend like that. And now Clara, asking all those questions about her death, it must have brought it all back. Mrs. Grayson's eyes met Miss Marple's, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension. It did, she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. It brought back everything. The way Anna used to laugh, the way she'd walk through the village with her head held high. Even when people whispered about her, Clara, she reminded me of Anna in a way, not in looks, but in that stubborn streak, always digging, always wanting to know more. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. Clara reminded you of Anna, she repeated softly. How interesting. Did you ever tell Clara that, or perhaps warn her to be careful with all her questions? Mrs. Grayson's face hardened, and she straightened in her chair. I told her to leave well enough alone, she said sharply. I told her that stirring up the past never does anyone any good. But she wouldn't listen. And now, look what's happened. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. There was something here. Something Mrs. Grayson wasn't saying. The older woman's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white, and Miss Marple knew better than to push too hard. Instead, she shifted the conversation, her tone as light as ever. You're quite right, of course, she said. The past can be a dangerous thing to meddle with. I suppose that's why so many people in the village are reluctant to talk about Anna's death. But you, Mrs. Grayson, you've always had such a good memory for the little details. Did you ever notice anything odd about Clara? Anything that might explain why someone would want to harm her? Mrs. Grayson hesitated, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting someone to be listening. Well, she said slowly, there was one thing. A few weeks ago, I saw her coming out of the post office, looking all flustered. She was holding a letter, and when she saw me, she stuffed it into her pocket like she didn't want me to see. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. A letter, she said, her voice thoughtful. How interesting. Did you happen to see who it was from? No, Mrs. Grayson said, shaking her head. But she was acting strange, like she was afraid of something. I asked her if she was all right, but she just mumbled something and hurried off. I didn't see her much after that, not until, well, you know. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over this new piece of information. The anonymous letter Clara had received, the one Mary had mentioned, was clearly significant. And now Mrs. Grayson had seen it too, or at least seen Clara with it. Was Mrs. Grayson telling the truth, or was she holding something back? Miss Marple's instincts told her there was more to this story, but she would need to tread carefully. The conversation drifted to safer topics: village gossip, the upcoming church bazaar, the state of Mrs. Grayson's roses, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She thought of Clara, young and curious, asking questions about a death that had long been buried. She thought of Anna Hawthorne, whose photograph she had seen in Reginald Hawthorne's study, her face so strikingly similar to Clara's, and she thought of Mrs. Grayson, whose bitterness seemed to run deeper than mere neighbourly envy. As Miss Marple rose to leave, thanking Mrs. Grayson for the tea, she paused at the door. "You've been most helpful, Mrs. Grayson," she said, her eyes twinkling with that deceptive mildness. "It's so important to understand the people around us, don't you think? Especially in a village like ours, where everyone knows everyone else's business. Mrs. Grayson managed a tight smile. Yes, well, some people's business is best left alone. Miss Marple nodded, stepping out into the cool afternoon air. The gate creaked behind her, and as she walked back toward her cottage, her mind was abuzz with possibilities. Mrs. Grayson's tale had revealed more than the older woman realized. Her dislike of Clara was clear, but there was something personal in it, something tied to Anna Hawthorne and the secrets of Willow Cottage. Miss Marple's needles would click late into the night, she knew, as she unravelled the threads of this mystery. One stitch at a time, the rest of the day passed quietly. But Miss Marple's thoughts were far from idle. She sat by her window, watching the village go about its business, children playing in the lane, the postman making his rounds, the vicar's wife still fussing over her flowers. But her mind was on Clara, on the letter, on Mrs. Grayson's guarded words. She thought of the locket Mary had mentioned, the one Clara wore with initials not her own. Could it be connected to Anna? And if so, what had Clara discovered that made her a threat? That evening, Miss Marple attended a meeting of the Women's Institute, where the talk was, predictably, of Clara's death. The village hall was filled, with the usual faces: Mrs. Bantry, bustling about with her usual energy; Miss Weatherby, who always had an opinion on everything; and young Lucy Adams, who had been Clara's friend and was still re-died from grief. Miss Marple listened quietly, her needles never still, as the women speculated about the poison, the suspects, and the scandal that had descended on St. Mary Mead. Clara was such a sweet girl, Lucy said, her voice trembling. She didn't deserve this. She was just trying to do what was right. Miss Marple glanced up, her eyes sharp. What was right, my dear? She asked gently. Did Clara ever tell you what she was working on, what she was so curious about? Lucy hesitated, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. She didn't say much, she admitted, but she was upset about something. She kept saying she had to find out the truth, for someone's sake. I thought she meant Mr. Hawthorne at first, but now I'm not so sure. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The truth, for someone's sake. It was a phrase that echoed Mrs. Grayson's words about Anna, about leaving the past alone. She thought of the locket, the letter, the photograph in Hawthorne's study. Pieces of a puzzle scattered across St. Mary Mead, waiting to be fitted together as the meeting drew to a close. Miss Marple slipped out into the cool night air, her shawl wrapped tightly around her. The village was dark now, the lights in the cottages glowing softly, and she felt a familiar thrill, the sense that she was on the verge of understanding something vital. Mrs. Grayson's tale had given her a new thread to follow, one that led back to Anna Hawthorne and the secrets of Willow Cottage. But there was more to uncover, she was sure of it. Clara's death was no random act of malice. It was tied to the past, to a truth someone was desperate to keep hidden. The next morning, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the post office. If Clara had received an anonymous letter, there might be some clue there, a postmark, a slip of the tongue from the postmistress, anything that could point to its origin. The post office was a small, cluttered space, with stacks of envelopes and parcels behind the counter and a faint smell of ink and paper. Mrs. Cleary, the postmistress, greeted Miss Marple with her usual cheer, though her eyes were tired, as if the villagers' troubles had taken their toll. Good morning, Miss Marple, Mrs. Cleary said, adjusting her spectacles. What can I do for you today? Oh, just a few stamps, I think, Miss Marple said, her tone as innocent as ever. Though I did hear something curious the other day about a letter Clara Brent received. Mrs. Grayson mentioned seeing her at the post office, looking rather upset. I don't suppose you remember anything about it. Mrs. Cleary's face clouded over. Poor Clara, she said. I do remember that day. She came in to collect a letter, nothing unusual, just a plain envelope, no return address. But she was in a state, I could tell. Kept looking over her shoulder, like she was expecting someone to be watching. Miss Marple's heart quickened. No return address, she repeated. How odd. Did you happen to notice where it was postmarked? Mrs. Cleary frowned, thinking. Let me see. I believe it was London. Yes, that's right. I remember because I thought it was strange, Clara getting a letter from so far away. She didn't have any family in London, did she? Not that I know of, Miss Marple said, her mind already turning over this new piece of information. A letter from London, anonymous, upsetting Clara enough to make her nervous. It was another thread, another piece of the puzzle as she left. The post office, stamps in hand, Miss Marple's thoughts were racing. London was a big place, but it wasn't impossible to trace a letter, especially if she could enlist Inspector Craddock's help. And then there was Mrs. Grayson, whose bitterness toward Clara seemed to hide something deeper. Jealousy, perhaps, or guilt. Miss Marple thought of the way Mrs. Grayson had spoken of Anna, with a tenderness that seemed out of character for her usual sharp demeanour. There was a connection there, she was sure of it, but what? Over the next few days, Miss Marple continued. Her quiet investigations, her visits to neighbours and her chats at the village shop, all carefully calculated to elicit information without arousing suspicion. She learned that Mrs. Grayson had once been close to Anna Hawthorne, often visiting Willow Cottage in the years before Anna's death. Some said they had been friends, though Mrs. Grayson's envy of Anna's beauty and wealth had strained their relationship. Others whispered that Mrs. Grayson had been in love with Reginald Hawthorne, a rumour Miss Marple filed away for further consideration. She also learned more about Clara's habits. The girl had been diligent, hard-working, but curious to a fault. She had spent hours in the village library, poring over old newspapers, and had once asked the librarian about records of deaths in St. Mary Mead. It was clear she had been searching for something, and Miss Marple was increasingly certain it had to do with Anna Hawthorne. One afternoon, as Miss Marple sat in her garden, knitting and thinking, she was visited by Inspector Craddock. The young inspector, who had come to value Miss Marple's insights, looked tired but determined. Miss Marple, he said, settling into a chair with a cup of tea, I'm at my wit's end. We've got suspects, we've got motives, but nothing solid. Dr. Wells swears he only ordered that chemical for research. Thomas's alibi is shaky but not disproven, and Mr. Hawthorne, well, he's not exactly forthcoming. What do you make of it? Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly. I think, Inspector, that we're dealing with a puzzle that's all about the past. Clara was looking into something to do with Anna Hawthorne's death. I believe she received a letter that set her on that path, and someone didn't want her to find out what she was looking for. Craddock leaned forward, his interest piqued. A letter. Do you know anything about it? Only that it came from London, with no return address, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Grayson saw Clara with it, and Mrs. Cleary confirmed it was postmarked there. I think if we could find out who sent that letter, we'd be a step closer to understanding why Clara was killed. Craddock nodded, scribbling in his notebook. London's a big place, but we can try to trace it. Anything else? Chapter 9. The hidden clue, the church, bazaar in St. Mary Mead, was always a grand affair. a yearly spectacle that drew the entire village into a whirlwind of activity. The village green, usually a quiet expanse dotted with wildflowers, transformed into a bustling hub of stalls and chatter. Trestle tables groaned under the weight of homemade jams, knitted scarves, and slightly lopsided cakes, while children darted between the adults, clutching sticky toffee apples. The air carried the mingled scents of fresh scones, brewing tea, and the faint mustiness of second-hand books piled high on a corner table. It was the kind of event where secrets slipped out as easily as coins from a pocket, and Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and unassuming air, was in her element. She stood near the tea tent, her hands busy arranging a tray of Victoria sponges, her grey hair tucked neatly under a sensible hat. To the casual observer, she was just another elderly spinster lending a hand, her mild expression betraying nothing of the keen mind at work. But Miss Marple was listening, always listening, her ears attuned to the hum of village gossip that buzzed like bees around the stalls. Today, her focus was sharper than ever, for the death of Clara Brent still hung over St. Mary Mead like a storm cloud, and the clues were proving elusive. The bazaar was in full swing by mid-morning, with Mrs. Bantry, the formidable organizer, barking orders at volunteers with the precision of a general. Miss Marple had volunteered to help with the bric-a-brac stall, a strategic choice, as it was the perfect spot to overhear snippets of conversation. People lingered over chipped teacups and faded postcards, their tongues loosened by the casual atmosphere. She adjusted a pair of tarnished candlesticks on the table, her movements deliberate. As her eyes scanned the crowd, it was then that she heard it a low, urgent exchange between two women near the second-hand clothing store. Miss Marple recognized them at once: Mrs. Lucy Price, the postmistress's sister, and Miss Ellen Carter, a seamstress known for her sharp tongue and sharper needles. They stood close together, their heads bent over a pile of scarves, their voices barely above a whisper. "Did you see it, Ellen?" Mrs. Price was saying, her tone laced with intrigue. "That locket Clara always wore, gold with those funny initials. Never took it off, did she?" Miss Marple's fingers paused on a cracked porcelain figurine. Clara's locket. She had noticed it herself at Mr. Hawthorne's party, a delicate oval of gold that hung around the young housekeeper's neck, glinting in the candlelight. It had seemed an odd accessory for a girl of Clara's modest means, but Miss Marple had thought little of it at the time, distracted by Clara's nervous demeanor. Now, the mention of it sent a prickle down her spine. Ellen Carter's voice dropped even lower, and Miss Marple edged closer, pretending to rearrange a stack of chipped saucers. "Not her initials, that's for sure," Ellen said, her eyes darting around to ensure no one was listening. "CB, it said, not Clara Brent. I asked her about it once, you know, when I was mending her apron. She got all flustered, said it was a family heirloom. But I swear, Lucy, I saw those initials before years ago, on something that belonged to Mrs. Hawthorne." Mrs. Price gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "You don't mean Anna Hawthorne, Reginald's wife?" Ellen nodded, her lips pursed. "I'm not one for gossip, mind you, but it's queer, isn't it? Clara poking around Willow Cottage, asking questions about Anna's death, and now she's gone, too. And that locket's not among her things. I heard Mary say so." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained as placid as ever. She set down the figurine and moved to a nearby table, ostensibly to adjust a display of embroidered napkins, but her mind was racing. Clara's locket, engraved with initials that weren't her own. a connection to Anna Hawthorne, whose death had been whispered about in the village for years. And now the locket was missing, vanished from Clara's belongings after her death. It was a clue, a tangible thread in the tangled web of this mystery, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle coming into focus. She glanced across the green, where Inspector Craddock was making his rounds, his notebook tucked under one arm. He was a competent man, thorough in his way, but he lacked the intuition for the human heart that Miss Marple had honed over decades in St. Mary Mead. She knew the locket was significant, not just for what it was, but for what it represented a secret Clara had carried. Perhaps the very secret that had led to her death. The bazaar continued around her, a kaleidoscope of voices and colours. Mrs. Bantry's laugh rang out as she haggled with old Mr. Pye over a brass candelabra, and a group of children shrieked with delight as they played tag near the tombola. But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of what she'd heard. Clara had been asking questions about Anna Hawthorne, Reginald's late wife, whose death had been ruled an accident, but was now shrouded in suspicion. The locket, with its mysterious initials, might have been a keepsake from Anna, a clue to a hidden connection between the young housekeeper and the woman who had died years before. Miss Marple's mind drifted to a memory from her own past. A case in St. Mary Mead years ago that had hinged on a similar object, a brooch, passed down through a family that had revealed a long-buried truth. Objects, she knew, had a way of holding secrets, their significance overlooked by those who saw only their surface. A locket wasn't just jewelry. It was a story, a link to the past, and in this case, perhaps the key to a motive. She made her way to the tea tent, where Mary, Clara's friend, was pouring cups of Earl Grey with a weary expression. Mary had been close to Clara, perhaps the closest person to her in the village, and Miss Marple had been meaning to speak with her again. The girl's eyes were red-rimmed, her grief still raw, but she managed a small smile as Miss Marple approached. "Miss Marple, would you like a cup?" Mary asked, her voice soft. "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple said, accepting the steaming cup. She took a sip, then leaned in slightly, her tone gentle but probing. "Mary, I was just thinking about Clara. She was such a lovely girl. I remember that pretty locket she wore. Gold, wasn't it? With some initials engraved on it." Mary's hand faltered on the teapot, and she set it down with a small clink. "Yes, that's right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She never took it off, said it was special to her, something from her family. But it's gone now. When I went through her things, it wasn't there. I thought maybe she'd lost it, but..." She trailed off, her brow furrowing. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic, but her mind sharp. "It's odd, isn't it, how things go missing? Did Clara ever say anything about what those initials meant, or where the locket came from?" Mary hesitated, glancing around the tent as if afraid someone might overhear. She didn't say much, only that it was a keepsake. But a few days before she died, she was upset. Said she'd found out something about Mr. Hawthorne, something that made her think twice about working at Willow Cottage. She wouldn't tell me what, but she kept touching that locket, like it was a comfort to her. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was racing. Clara had been digging into Hawthorne's past, perhaps uncovering the truth about Anna's death. The locket, with its initials, might have been a tangible link to that truth, a piece of evidence someone had been desperate to conceal. Its absence from Clara's belongings suggested it had been taken by her killer, perhaps to hide whatever secret it held. "Thank you, Mary," Miss Marple said, patting the girl's hand. "You've been very helpful. Now, don't you worry. These things have a way of sorting themselves out." As she left the tea tent, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects. Reginald Hawthorne, with his secretive nature and troubled past. Thomas, his nephew, whose financial troubles made him desperate. Mrs. Lila Grayson, whose jealousy of Clara seemed to mask a deeper grievance. And Dr. Simon Wells, the village doctor, whose access to the rare toxin used in Clara's murder made him a compelling suspect. The locket could belong to any of their stories, but Miss Marple's instincts pointed to a connection with Anna Hawthorne, a thread that tied Clara's death to the tragedy of years past. She wandered back to the bric-a-brac stall, her eyes scanning the crowd for familiar faces. Mrs. Grayson was there, haggling over a set of doilies, her face pinched with displeasure. Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. "Mrs. Grayson, how lovely to see you," she said, her voice warm. "I was just admiring your taste in linens. Clara used to help with the stall, didn't she? Such a shame about her locket. I heard it was quite special." Mrs. Grayson's face tightened, her fingers clutching the doilies. "I wouldn't know about that," she said curtly. "Clara was always showing off her trinkets. Probably lost it somewhere." Miss Marple nodded, unfazed by the woman's sharpness. "Perhaps," she said lightly, "though it's strange, isn't it? A locket like that, so personal, going missing just after her death, almost as if someone didn't want it found." Mrs. Grayson's eyes flickered, but she said nothing, turning back to the stall with a dismissive shrug. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind noting the woman's unease. Mrs. Grayson had admitted to disliking Clara, believing her to be after Hawthorne's wealth, but was there more to her resentment? Had she seen the locket and recognized its significance? The afternoon wore on, and Miss Marple moved through the bazaar, her ears open to every whisper. She spoke with Mr. Pye, who mentioned seeing Clara arguing with Dr. Wells near the church a week before her death. She chatted with the vicar's wife, who recalled Clara asking about old parish records, specifically those from the year Anna Hawthorne died. Each conversation added a piece to the puzzle, and Miss Marple's knitting needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in rhythm with her thoughts. By the time the bazaar began to wind down, the sun dipping low over the village green, Miss Marple was certain of one thing. The locket was the key. It wasn't just a sentimental trinket. It was a clue to Clara's investigation into Anna Hawthorne's death, and someone had taken it to keep that secret buried. The question was who and why. As she helped pack away the unsold items from the bric-a-brac stall, Miss Marple's mind turned to Dr. Wells, his access to the toxin, his connection to Clara through her medication, and his nervous demeanor when questioned all pointed to a man with something to hide. Could the locket be in his possession? Or had Hawthorne, with his locked drawer and guarded secrets, taken it to protect his own past? Thomas, too, couldn't be ruled out. His desperation for money, a powerful motive, and Mrs. Grayson's bitterness hinted at a personal stake Miss Marple had yet to uncover. She paused, her hands resting on a box of unsold knickknacks, and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the pieces settle in her mind. The locket, with its initials CB, not Clara Brent's. A connection to Anna Hawthorne, perhaps a family tie. A missing letter, warning Clara of danger. And a killer, lurking among the familiar faces of St. Mary Mead, who had poisoned a young woman to keep a secret buried. Miss Marple opened her eyes, her resolve firm. She would find that locket, or at least uncover what it represented. The truth, she knew, was like her knitting tangled at first, but with patience and care, the pattern would emerge. She gathered her shawl and made her way home, the hum of the bazaar fading behind her, already planning her next steps in the quiet of her cottage. Chapter 10. A memory from St. Mary Mead. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat in her favourite armchair, a cup of tea cooling on the table. Beside her, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The village of St. Mary Mead was quiet today, save for the occasional chirp of a sparrow or the distant clatter of a milk cart making its rounds. But Miss Marple's mind was far from tranquil. Her thoughts were tangled in the web of Clara Brent's death, the mysterious locket, and the whispers of secrets that seemed to cling to Willow Cottage like ivy. She set her knitting down for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the soft wall. Her eyes, sharp and bright despite her age, drifted to the window, where she could see the neat rows of cottages lining the lane. St. Mary Mead had always been a place of secrets, she thought, not the grand, dramatic secrets of city scandals, but the quiet, buried ones grudges nursed over decades, promises broken in whispered conversations, and truths hidden behind polite smiles. Clara's death had stirred something up, like dust disturbed in an old attic, and Miss Marple was determined to sweep it clean. Her mind wandered back to a case from years ago, one that had unfolded in this very village. It had been a summer, much like this one, with roses blooming in every garden and the air heavy with the scent of lavender. A young woman, Ellen Carter, had been found dead in the orchard behind the vicarage, her body discovered by the vicar's wife during an evening stroll. The village had been shocked. Of course, murder was not a common occurrence in St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple had seen the patterns others missed. Ellen had been a quiet girl, a seamstress with a talent for embroidery, but she had been asking questions about her employer, a wealthy widow named Mrs. Langley, who had a reputation for generosity but a shadow of something darker in her past. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her lips pursing as she recalled the details. Ellen had been seen arguing with Mrs. Langley's nephew, a charming but reckless young man named Henry, who stood to inherit her fortune. There had been whispers of a hidden family connection, a secret adoption, a child given up years before that Ellen had stumbled upon. She had been curious, perhaps too curious, and her questions had led her to a truth someone wanted buried. The clue that had unravelled it all was a small silver brooch, engraved with initials that matched no one in Mrs. Langley's household. It had been found clutched in Ellen's hand, and it had pointed Miss Marple to the truth. Henry had killed Ellen to protect his inheritance, fearing she would expose his illegitimacy and ruin his claim. The memory settled over Miss Marple like a familiar shawl, warm but heavy. She picked up her knitting again, her fingers moving with practiced ease, but her mind was elsewhere. Clara Brent's death felt eerily similar. The locket, engraved with initials not her own, was a thread that connected the present to the past. Miss Marple was certain Clara had been digging into something dangerous, something tied to Mr. Reginald Hawthorne's late wife, Anna. The photograph of Anna in Willow Cottage, with her striking resemblance to Clara, had not escaped Miss Marple. Notice, could Clara have been a relative, a niece, perhaps, or a cousin seeking answers about Anna's death? And if so, who had been threatened enough by her questions to poison her? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She glanced up, her expression softening as she called, "Come in, dear." The door opened to reveal Mary, Clara's friend from the village. her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She wore a simple grey dress, her dark hair pinned neatly but her hands twisting nervously at her sides. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I needed to talk to someone." "Not at all, Mary," Miss Marple said kindly, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Sit down, dear. Would you like some tea? I've just made a fresh pot." Mary shook her head, perching on the edge of the chair, as though ready to flee at any moment. "No, thank you. It's about Clara. I can't stop thinking about her, and I think I know something that might help." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained calm and encouraging. "Go on, dear. Whatever it is. You can tell me." Mary took a deep breath, her fingers tightening in her lap. She was different in the days before she died. She was scared, I think. She wouldn't tell me everything, but she said she'd found something. About Mr. Hawthorne. She said it was about his wife, Anna, and how she died. Clara thought it wasn't an accident, like everyone said. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind racing. Did she say what she'd found, or where she learned it? "She mentioned a letter," Mary said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Not the anonymous one she got, but another one. She said she found it in Willow Cottage, hidden in a book in the library. It was old, written years ago, and it mentioned Anna. Clara wouldn't tell me more, but she said it proved Mr. Hawthorne had done something terrible." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her face remained serene. "A letter in a book," she murmured. "How curious. Did she say which book, or where in the library?" Mary shook her head. "No, she didn't. I told her she should go to the police, but she said she needed more proof. She was so determined. Miss Marple, I think she felt she owed it to someone, maybe Whodunit, to find the truth." Miss Marple reached out and patted Mary's hand gently. "You've done the right thing, telling me this, Mary. Clara was a brave girl, and we'll make sure her efforts weren't in vain. Now, try not to worry. Would you like to stay for a bit? I have some lovely scones from Mrs. Baker," Mary managed. A small smile, but she shook her head again. "Thank you, but I should get back. My mother's expecting me. I needed to tell someone who'd understand." "I do understand," Miss Marple said softly. "And I promise you, Mary, I'll do everything I can to help." After Mary left, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her knitting forgotten for the moment. A letter hidden in a book, she thought. It was exactly the sort of thing that could hold the key to Clara's death. She recalled her visit to Willow Cottage, the locked drawer in Hawthorne's study, and the photograph of Anna. The library had been there too, a grand room filled with leather-bound books and heavy oak shelves. She hadn't lingered there, but now she wished she had. If Clara had found something in one of those books, it could be the clue that tied everything together. Miss Marple rose from her chair, moving with a purpose that belied her age. She slipped on her coat and hat, picked up her umbrella more out of habit than necessity, as the sky was clear, and set off for the vicarage. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was an old friend, and his wife, Griselda, was always eager to share the latest village gossip. If anyone had heard whispers about Clara's activities or Hawthorne's past, it would be Griselda. The walk to the vicarage was pleasant, the air crisp and the hedgerows bursting with late summer blooms. Miss Marple nodded politely to Mrs. Price, who was sweeping her front step, and exchanged a few words with young Tommy, the butcher's boy, who was cycling past with a delivery. By the time she reached the vicarage, her mind was buzzing with possibilities, but she kept her expression as placid as ever. Griselda greeted her with a delighted smile, ushering her into the drawing room. "Miss Marple, what a treat to see you. I was just saying to Leonard that we haven't had a proper chat in ages. Come, sit down. I'll get some tea." "No need for that, Griselda," dear Miss Marple said, settling onto the sofa. "I've just had some, but I wouldn't say no to one of your biscuits. I've come to talk about Clara Brent. I understand she was quite close to some of the village girls." Griselda's eyes widened, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, poor Clara. It's just awful, isn't it? Everyone's talking about it. I heard she was poisoned, can you imagine, in St. Mary Mead? But yes, she was friendly with Mary and a few others. Always so cheerful. Clara was, but lately, well, she seemed distracted. Distracted?" Miss Marple prompted, her tone gentle but probing. Griselda nodded, reaching for a tin of biscuits and offering it to Miss Marple. "Yes, I noticed it at the church tea last week. She was helping serve, but she kept looking out the window as if she was expecting someone. And she asked me the oddest question about Mr. Hawthorne's wife, Anna. She wanted to know if anyone in the village remembered her, or if there were any relatives still about." Miss Marple selected a biscuit and nibbled it thoughtfully. "And what did you tell her?" "Well, I said I didn't know much," Griselda admitted. "Anna died before we came to St. Mary Mead, you know. But I told her to ask old Mrs. Harmon, who's been here forever. She might remember something." Clara seemed very interested, though she didn't say why. Miss Marple's mind ticked over this new information. Mrs. Harmon, the elderly widow who lived at the edge of the village, was known for her sharp memory and love of storytelling. If Clara had gone to her, she might have uncovered something. Significant perhaps even the letter Mary had mentioned. "Thank you, Griselda," Miss Marple said, rising. "You've been most helpful. I think I'll pay Mrs. Harmon a visit." "Oh, do be careful, Miss Marple," Griselda said, her eyes wide. "This whole business with Clara, it's got everyone on edge. You don't think it's dangerous, do you?" Miss Marple smiled reassuringly. "I'm sure it's nothing an old spinster like me can't handle, dear. Now, I mustn't keep you." Mrs. Harmon's cottage was a short walk from the vicarage, nestled behind a riot of hollyhocks and roses. The old woman was in her garden when Miss Marple arrived, her hands busy with a pair of pruning shears. Despite her age, Mrs. Harmon's eyes were as sharp as ever, and she greeted Miss Marple with a knowing smile. "Jane Marple," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I thought you might come by, with all this talk about Clara Brent. Come inside, I've got the kettle on." Miss Marple followed her into the cosy kitchen, where the scent of baking bread filled the air. Mrs. Harmon poured tea and set out a plate of homemade shortbread, then fixed Miss Marple with a shrewd look. "You're here about Clara, Aunt. You, poor girl. I warned her she was meddling in things best left alone." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her expression calm. "Did Clara come to see you, Mrs. Harmon?" "She did," Mrs. Harmon said, stirring sugar into her tea. "About a week ago, maybe less. She was asking about Anna Hawthorne. Mr. Hawthorne's late wife. Wanted to know if I remembered her, or if she had any family in the area. I told her what I knew, that Anna was a lovely woman, quiet, but with a sadness about her. She died suddenly, you know, a fall down the stairs at Willow Cottage. Everyone said it was an accident, but there were whispers even then. Whispers." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes intent. Mrs. Harmon nodded. Some said Mr. Hawthorne wasn't as grief-stricken as he should have been. He married Anna for her money. You see, she came from a wealthy family, the Draytons up north. There was talk that he'd been seen with another woman before Anna's death, but nothing came of it. And then there was the matter of Anna's sister, Margaret. She and Anna were close, but Margaret left the area after Anna died. No one's heard from her since. Miss Marple's mind raced. A sister. Could Clara have been connected to Margaret, perhaps her daughter or niece? It would explain her interest in Anna's death and her resemblance to the woman in the photograph. Did Clara say why she was asking? Miss Marple pressed gently. Mrs. Harmon hesitated, her fingers tapping the edge of her teacup. She said she'd found something, a letter, I think, that made her think Anna's death wasn't an accident. She wouldn't tell me more, but she was scared, Jane. I could see it in her eyes. I told her to be careful, but, well, you know what happened. Miss Marple nodded, her heart heavy. Thank you, Mrs. Harmon. You've been very helpful. If you remember anything else, will you let me know? Of course, Mrs. Harmon said, her voice softening. Clara was a good girl. She didn't deserve this. As Miss Marple walked back to her cottage, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift into place. Clara had been investigating Anna's death, likely believing Hawthorne was responsible. The letters she'd found, hidden in a book, must have contained evidence or at least a hint of foul play. The locket, with its mysterious initials, could be a link to Anna's family, perhaps Margaret, and the anonymous letter Clara had received might have been a warning from someone who knew the truth. Someone who feared Clara was getting too close. By the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the lane. She settled back into her armchair, picking up her knitting but not working on it. Instead, she closed her eyes, letting her mind wander back to the Ellen Carter case. The brooch had been the key then, a tangible clue that pointed to a hidden truth. The locket, she was certain, was the key now. If she could find it or learn whose initials it bore, she might unravel the motive behind Clara's murder. The evening passed quietly, with Miss Marple turning the problem over in her mind, like a puzzle box, testing each piece for fit. She thought of Hawthorne, with his guarded demeanor and locked drawer, of Dr. Wells, with his access to the poison, of Thomas, with his shaky alibi, and of Mrs. Grayson, with her jealousy and half-truths. One of them, she was sure, had poisoned Clara to protect a secret, but which one? And what was the secret? As the clock on the mantel struck 9, Miss Marple made a decision. Tomorrow she would return to Willow Cottage. She would find a way to search the library, to look for the book that held Clara's letter, and she would keep an eye out for the locket, wherever it might be. The truth was close, she could feel it, like the prickle of wool against her fingers as she knitted. For now, though she set her knitting aside and rose to make another cup of tea, St. Mary Mead might seem peaceful, but beneath its calm surface, secrets were stirring, and Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, was determined to bring them to light. The next morning, Miss Marple woke early, her mind already buzzing with plans. She dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan, pinned her hat firmly in place, and set out for Willow Cottage. The village was stirring now, with children running to school and shopkeepers opening their doors. Miss Marple nodded to Mr. Pye, the baker, and paused to admire Mrs. Turner's roses, all the while keeping her purpose firmly in mind. When she reached Willow Cottage, she found the gates slightly ajar, as though someone had left in a hurry. The garden was quiet, the roses drooping slightly in the morning dew. Miss Marple knocked on the door, her umbrella tucked under her arm, and waited. After a moment, Mr. Hawthorne himself answered, his face pale and his eyes shadowed. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained but polite. "What a surprise! To what do I owe the visit?" "I was passing by," Miss Marple said brightly, "and I thought I might return that book you lent me at the party. Such a lovely library you have. May I come in for a moment?" Hawthorne hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course, please, come in." Miss Marple followed him into the house, her eyes taking in every detail: the polished wood of the staircase, the faint scent of lavender polish, the closed door to the study. Hawthorne led her to the library, a grand room with tall windows and shelves that reached the ceiling. The books were a mix of old and new, some with worn leather bindings, others crisp and modern. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Somewhere in this room, she was sure, was the letter Clara had found. "This is a fine collection," she said, running her fingers lightly over a row of books. "Clara mentioned you had some rare volumes. She was quite fond of reading, wasn't she?" Hawthorne's expression tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, she was. She often borrowed books from here. I still can't believe she's gone." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes scanning the shelves. "It's such a tragedy. I understand she was curious about your late wife, Anna. Did she ever mention anything to you about her?" Hawthorne's hand froze on the arm of a chair. "Anna, no, not really. Why do you ask?" "Oh, just something I heard," Miss Marple said vaguely, moving to another shelf. "Village gossip, you know. People do talk." She paused at a row of older books, their spines cracked and faded. One caught her eye, copy of Pride and Prejudice, its cover worn but intact. Clara had loved Jane Austen, Mary had said. Could this be the book? Miss Marple reached for it, her movements slow and deliberate. "May I?" she asked, glancing at Hawthorne. He nodded, though his eyes were wary, of course. Miss Marple opened the book, flipping through the pages with care. There, tucked between the final chapter and the back cover, was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Her heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. "How interesting," she murmured, slipping the paper into her sleeve with a deft movement. "Such a lovely edition. I must borrow it sometime." Hawthorne seemed to relax slightly, unaware of her find. "Yes, it's one of the older ones. Feel free to borrow it whenever you like." They chatted for a few more minutes, Miss Marple keeping the conversation light and inconsequential. When she left Willow Cottage, the letter was safely tucked in her handbag, and her mind was racing. She waited until she was back in her own sitting room before unfolding it, her hand steady despite her excitement. The letter was written in a neat, feminine hand, dated nearly 20 years earlier. It was addressed to Margaret Drayton, Anna's sister, and signed by a woman named Eliza, who appeared to be a servant at Willow Cottage. The words were brief but damning. "Dear Margaret, I cannot keep silent any longer. I saw what happened the night Anna died. It was no accident." Mr. Hawthorne pushed her. "He thought no one was watching, but I was there, in the shadows of the hall. I've kept quiet all these years, but my conscience weighs heavy. If you wish to seek justice, I will stand by you. Yours, Eliza." Miss Marple's breath caught. This was the proof Clara had found, the reason she had been so determined and so afraid. Eliza, the servant, must have been the one who sent Clara the anonymous letter, warning her of the danger. But where was Eliza now, And who had known Clara had this letter? Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her desk. She would need to speak to Inspector Craddock, but first she needed to find the locket. Its initials, she was certain, would confirm Clara's connection to Honor and perhaps point to the killer. The day was not yet over, and there was much to do as she picked up her knitting. Miss Marple's mind was already spinning new threads, weaving together the clues that would unravel the truth. Clara Brent had been brave, but her courage had cost her life. Miss Marple would not let that sacrifice be in vain.